My family locked me out in the freezing snow on Christmas Eve because my worn-out coat would ruin their perfect aesthetic. My father looked me dead in the eyes and said I would never amount to anything. 8 months later, my face was plastered across Forbes as the top tech innovator of the year. When their logistics empire collapsed, and they came begging for a multi-million-dollar bailout, I just smiled and asked where their holiday spirit went. My name is Sydney, and I am 33 years old. I used to believe that family was your safe harbor until that freezing night when I realized I was just an embarrassment to my own flesh and blood. Before I tell you how my software ended up becoming the exact instrument of their spectacular downfall, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever been pushed to rock bottom by the people who are supposed to love you the most. The icy winter wind whipped fiercely through my thin coat as I stood on the porch of my parents' million-dollar mansion. Snow was falling heavily, clinging to the cherry pie and the wrapped gift box I held in my hands. I took a deep breath and reached out to knock. Before my knuckles touched the heavy oak wood, the door cracked open. My younger sister Melanie stood blocking the entrance. She looked at my scuffed winter boots now covered in slush and let out a dramatic sigh. She asked if I had completely ignored the family group chat messages. She told me Mom and Dad specifically said I should not come tonight. I froze on the welcome mat, the pie suddenly feeling very heavy. I stammered, explaining I had been coding my software program all day and had not checked my phone once. I told her I just wanted to drop off dessert and say Merry Christmas. Melanie tightly crossed her arms. She sneered, telling me that they were hosting a very important dinner, and my pathetic, struggling energy would simply bring everyone down. Through the narrow gap in the doorway, the warm light of the living room spilled out onto the snow, along with the loud sound of laughter and clinking crystal glasses. I peered past her shoulder and my stomach immediately dropped into a bottomless pit. Sitting comfortably on the custom velvet sofa was Jamal, Melanie's African-American husband. Jamal was a ruthless, highly successful hedge fund manager known across the city for making cutthroat investments. My father, Jonathan, the boastful owner of a mid-sized supply chain firm called Atlas Logistics, was practically tripping over himself to pour Jamal another expensive drink. My father desperately wanted Jamal to inject capital into his struggling company, but that was not what made my breath catch sharply in my throat. Sitting right next to my father, laughing loudly at some inside joke, was Brad. Brad was my ex-boyfriend. Just 2 months prior, I had caught him cheating on me in our own apartment, an event that had left me completely devastated while I was already drowning in the immense stress of running a failing tech startup. Yet here he was, drinking my father's expensive whiskey on Christmas Eve. The brutal reality of my family dynamic was on full display in that living room. I was the invisible scapegoat while Melanie was the spoiled princess, and my older brother Cameron was the undisputed golden child. Just last week, Cameron had been gifted a brand new Porsche by our parents simply for completing a basic corporate management course. Meanwhile, my mother Catherine, who was entirely obsessed with her country club status and neighborhood image, treated my artificial intelligence startup like a shameful disease. Just a month ago, I had begged my father for a tiny $2,000 loan just to keep my software servers running for another week. He had thrown a handful of crumpled dollar bills at my chest and told me to go get a real job waiting tables. My father must have noticed the freezing draft blowing in from the open door because he walked over his expensive leather loafers clicking loudly against the polished marble floor. When he saw me standing outside in the bitter cold, his jovial expression instantly hardened into a scowl of pure, unfiltered disgust. He pushed Melanie aside and stepped out onto the porch, quickly closing the door behind him to keep the warm air inside. He looked me up and down, his eyes filled with absolute contempt. He told me that coming here looking like a homeless beggar was going to ruin the entire mood of his evening. He aggressively explained that Jamal was evaluating our family for a massive financial investment, and Brad was his brand new business partner. He looked me dead in the eyes and said Brad had far more value to this family than my garbage software company ever would. He pointed a finger at me, telling me to turn around and leave immediately, warning me never to show my face at his house again until I stopped being a complete failure. He stepped back inside and slammed the heavy oak door right in my face. The loud click of the deadbolt locking echoed sharply in the freezing air. I stood completely alone in the dark, the heavy snow rapidly covering my shoulders. My bank account was severely overdrawn, my heart was completely shattered, and my own family had just chosen my cheating ex-boyfriend over me. I did not shed a single tear. I walked back to my beat-up sedan, set my cherry pie on the frozen hood of the car, and opened my laptop right there in the snow. With numb, shaking fingers, I connected to a nearby public internet signal and hit send on my final software pitch deck to a major venture capital firm in Silicon Valley. The icy winter wind whipped fiercely against my beat-up sedan as I drove through the blinding Chicago blizzard. My tires slipped on patches of black ice, causing the back end of the car to fishtail slightly, before I wrestled the steering wheel to regain control. I tightened my grip until my knuckles turned white, matching the desolate landscape around me. I was on my way to my parents' $1 million suburban mansion, carrying a homemade cherry pie and a fragile, desperate layer of hope. I had foolishly convinced myself that the spirit of Christmas might magically soften their hearts. I had desperately wanted just one evening of warmth, a brief respite from the crushing stress that had been suffocating me for the past year. Growing up in our affluent family meant privilege to outsiders, but inside our sprawling home, emotional coldness permeated every corner. My father, Jonathan, was the boastful owner of a mid-sized supply chain firm called Atlas Logistics. My mother, Catherine, was completely obsessed with her country club status and maintaining a flawless neighborhood image. Our household was a fortress of impossible expectations, a place where love was entirely conditional. The family dynamic was brutally simple. My older brother Cameron and my younger sister Melanie were the undisputed golden children. Cameron could gamble away company money and still be rewarded with a brand new luxury car, while Melanie was treated like a spoiled princess whose every whim was instantly catered to. I was the invisible scapegoat asked to stay in the background so my pathetic, struggling energy would not tarnish their perfect facade. I was utterly broke. My personal checking account was currently overdrawn by $40. Every single cent I had ever earned, every line of credit I could secure, and every ounce of my energy had been poured into developing my artificial intelligence auditing software. My parents despised my career choice. They dismissed my startup as a cute hobby and constantly demanded I get a real job. Just last month, when I begged my father for a tiny loan to keep my software servers running, he threw crumpled dollar bills at my chest and mocked my ambition. I had been living on cheap ramen noodles and tap water for months, sacrificing my health, my sleep, and my sanity to build something meaningful. But the financial ruin was only a fraction of the agony I carried with me through the blizzard. The absolute darkest shadow hanging over my soul was Brad. Just 2 short months ago, I had believed Brad was the one solid foundation in my rapidly crumbling life. We had been together for 3 years, sharing a cramped apartment and what I thought were shared dreams for the future. He had watched me sacrifice everything for my company, offering fake words of encouragement while quietly sharpening a knife to plunge into my back. The memory of catching him played on an agonizing loop in my mind. I had come home early from a grueling coding marathon because the servers had crashed only to find our apartment door unlocked. I had walked into our bedroom to find him tangled in our sheets with a junior marketing executive from his firm. The betrayal had been swift, brutal, and entirely unapologetic. He had packed his bags that very same night, telling me he was tired of dating a stressed-out broke failure who cared more about algorithms than his happiness. He had broken my heart, decimated my trust, and left me scrambling to cover the full rent on an apartment I could not afford. I had spent the last 8 weeks trying to scrape the pieces of my shattered self-esteem off the floor. I finally pulled into my family's pristine gated neighborhood, the brutal reality of the night sinking into my frozen bones. I parked in the driveway, grabbed my pie, and walked up to the heavy oak door. I knocked, craving a hug and a hot meal. The door cracked open, and Melanie stood there blocking the entrance. She looked at my scuffed winter boots now covered in slush, and let out a dramatic sigh. She sneered, telling me that Mom and Dad specifically said I should not come tonight because my presence would ruin the dinner. Through the narrow gap in the doorway, the warm light of the living room spilled out onto the snow. I peered past her shoulder, and my stomach immediately dropped into a bottomless pit. Sitting comfortably on the custom velvet sofa was Jamal Melanie's wealthy husband, being fawned over by my father. But sitting right next to my father, clinking expensive whiskey glasses and laughing warmly, was Brad. My cheating ex-boyfriend was sitting in my parents' living room. My own father had looked at the man who had deeply traumatized me and decided that he was a better fit for our family. My father had traded my loyalty for a lucrative business partnership. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow, knocking the breath completely out of my lungs. I stood frozen on the icy porch, staring past my sister's shoulder into the warmth of the living room I had grown up in. The sheer audacity of the scene unfolding before my eyes paralyzed me. I gripped the cardboard edges of the cherry pie box so tightly, my fingers cramped the flimsy cardboard buckling under my desperate hold. Melanie shifted her weight, the movement causing her emerald green designer silk dress to shimmer under the porch light. She looked down at my shivering frame with an expression of intense irritation, as if my very existence was a stain on her flawless evening. She leaned in closer, her voice dropping to a harsh, venomous whisper. She asked me what part of Do Not Come was so hard for me to understand. She hissed that I was embarrassing myself by showing up uninvited like a stray dog begging for scraps. I ignored her cruel words, my eyes locked on the men sitting by the roaring stone fireplace. The room was decorated, impeccably smelling of expensive pine and roasted cinnamon, a stark contrast to the bitter winter storm whipping around my fragile coat. There sat Jamal Melanie's African-American husband, radiating the kind of effortless authority that only comes from immense wealth. As a highly successful hedge fund manager, Jamal was the prize of the family. He wore a tailored suit and exuded a calm, commanding presence. My father, Jonathan, was hovering over him like an eager servant. Jonathan was usually a domineering, arrogant man, but tonight he was practically bending over backward, laughing too loudly at Jamal's jokes and constantly refilling his glass. It was a pathetic display of sycophancy. My father needed Jamal's hedge fund to bail out Atlas Logistics, and he was willing to sacrifice any shred of dignity to secure that investment. But Jamal was not the source of the bile rising in my throat. It was the man sitting directly across from him. Brad. The man who had shattered my heart, violated my trust, and left me to pick up the broken pieces of my life just 8 weeks ago. Brad was leaning back in my father's favorite leather armchair, his legs casually crossed, swirling an amber liquid in a heavy crystal glass. He looked completely at ease, perfectly integrated into the family that had just locked me out in the snow. A violent tremor racked my body, and it had nothing to do with the sub-zero temperature. I looked back at Melanie, my voice barely a cracked whisper as I asked her why Brad was sitting in our living room. I asked her how they could possibly invite the man who had cheated on me, the man who had abandoned me when I was at my absolute lowest. Melanie rolled her eyes, letting out a short, condescending scoff. She adjusted her perfect hair and looked at me with an expression completely devoid of empathy. She bluntly stated that Brad was a successful entrepreneur who actually brought value to the table. She coldly explained that Brad and my father had recently found common ground in their business ventures, and Dad saw a lot of potential in him. She crossed her arms tightly over her silk dress and delivered the ultimate insult. She told me that Brad was moving up in the world while I was just a broke college dropout playing pretend with a doomed tech startup. She sneered that the family could not afford to sever a lucrative connection just because I was too emotionally fragile to keep a man. Her words sliced through my chest like shards of broken glass. They had not just excluded me, they had replaced me. They had weighed my blood relation against Brad's bank account and decided that my trauma was an acceptable price to pay for a profitable networking opportunity. They were actively protecting my abuser, elevating him to a place of honor at the family holiday table, while treating their own daughter like a hazardous waste spill. I stared at Brad from across the snowy threshold. He must have felt the weight of my gaze because he suddenly turned his head toward the front door. For a fraction of a second, his eyes met mine through the narrow gap. He did not look surprised. He did not look guilty. A slow, arrogant smirk spread across his face, a silent declaration of his complete victory. He raised his crystal glass slightly in my direction, offering a mocking toast to the woman he had destroyed, before turning back to laugh at something my father said. The sheer cruelty of that smirk ignited a fire deep within my chest. Every sleepless night I had spent crying over him, every moment of panic I had endured trying to pay the rent. He abandoned every ounce of self-doubt that had plagued me for the past 2 months, suddenly vanished. The agonizing pain of betrayal evaporated, replaced by a cold, calculating clarity. This was not a family. This was a transaction. I was standing on the outside of a business deal, and they had collectively decided that my balance sheet was too low to grant me entry. Melanie shivered as a gust of wind blew snow onto the porch. She impatiently grabbed the edge of the heavy oak door, preparing to shut it. She told me to leave the pie on the steps and go back to my miserable little apartment. She warned me not to make a scene and ruin her husband's evening, claiming Jamal was already stressed enough by the market and did not need to witness my pathetic family drama. She looked me up and down one last time, her eyes lingering on my cheap fraying coat, and whispered that I was a complete embarrassment to the family name. My jaw clenched so tightly my teeth ached. My mind raced at 1,000,000 miles an hour, processing the monumental scale of their betrayal. My own mother, who had texted me empty platitudes about family unity, was currently in the kitchen preparing a holiday feast for the man who had slept with another woman in my bed. My sister was actively acting as the bouncer, ensuring my heartbreak did not interrupt the flow of expensive alcohol. And my father was eagerly grooming the man who had ruined my life to become his new business protege. I stood my ground on the frozen welcome mat, refusing to let Melanie close the door just yet. The icy wind howled around us, stinging my cheeks and freezing the tears that had threatened to fall just moments ago. I looked directly into my sister's eyes, searching for any trace of the little girl I had grown up with, any shred of familial loyalty or basic human decency. I found absolutely nothing. Her eyes were hard, shallow, and entirely consumed by self-interest. The physical cold seeping into my bones was nothing compared to the absolute zero temperature of my realization. I had spent my entire adult life trying to prove my worth to these people. I had worked myself into the ground, starved myself, and sacrificed every ounce of my personal happiness, trying to build a company they could finally be proud of. I had desperately craved a seat at their table, believing that if I just worked hard enough, if my software just became successful enough, they would finally look at me with the same pride and affection they showered upon Cameron and Melanie. But seeing Brad sitting in that chair holding that glass bathed in the warmth of my father's approval, the illusion finally shattered completely. They did not care about hard work. They did not care about morality or loyalty or love. They cared exclusively about immediate financial leverage. Brad had capital, so Brad was family. I had debt, so I was a stranger. I tightened my grip on the pie box. The sweet, warm smell of baked cherries wafted up a sickeningly wholesome contrast to the toxic reality unfolding before me. I had stayed up until 2 in the morning baking this pie from scratch, hoping it would be a peace offering, a sweet gesture to bridge the endless chasm between us. Now the very idea of them consuming it made my stomach turn. I realized that offering them my love was like throwing a beautiful painting into a blazing fire. They would only consume it and leave nothing but ashes behind. My father's heavy footsteps echoed against the marble floor, cutting through the festive noise of the living room. Jonathan had noticed the draft and the prolonged confrontation at the entryway. He strode toward the door, his jaw set in a rigid line of irritation. He placed a heavy hand on Melanie's shoulder, moving her aside with a swift, dismissive gesture. He stepped out onto the freezing porch, closing the door just enough to trap the warmth inside, leaving only a narrow sliver of light illuminating the driving snow. He did not offer a greeting. He did not ask how I was doing after driving through a dangerous blizzard. Instead, his eyes raked over me with unfiltered disdain. His gaze lingered on my frayed, oversized winter coat, the one I had bought from a thrift store 3 years ago. He looked at the scuffed toes of my boots and the cheap cardboard box holding the cherry pie I had baked. His expression was one of profound, unadulterated embarrassment. He crossed his arms, the expensive fabric of his custom-tailored suit straining slightly across his broad shoulders. His voice was low, sharp, and laced with absolute contempt. He told me that my pathetic, struggling energy was a toxic cloud that would completely ruin the mood of his crucial evening. He gestured back toward the living room, specifically toward the leather armchair where my cheating ex-boyfriend was currently nursing a premium scotch. He stated that Brad was his new business partner. My father explained they had recently closed a lucrative real estate deal together, and Brad possessed the exact kind of ruthless ambition this family valued. He pointed toward Jamal laughing by the fireplace. He sternly informed me that Jamal was representing a massive hedge fund currently evaluating Atlas Logistics for a multi-million-dollar capital injection. He looked back at me, his breath forming white clouds in the freezing air. He told me that dragging my miserable, broke existence into that living room would raise questions he simply did not want to answer. He said that my constant failures and my ridiculous little software project were massive liabilities to his current business negotiations. I asked him if money was truly more important than his own flesh and blood. I asked him how he could openly welcome the man who traumatized me while locking me out in a blizzard on Christmas Eve. My father did not flinch. His expression remained entirely devoid of empathy. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a harsh, final whisper. He said that business was about making smart investments, and right now Brad was a brilliant investment, while I was a complete write-off. He looked me dead in the eyes, his words meticulously chosen to inflict maximum damage. He said, "Go home now, Sydney. You will never amount to anything, and I will not have you embarrassing us tonight." He stepped backward and pulled the heavy oak door shut. The loud, definitive click of the deadbolt echoed like a gunshot in the silent, snowy night. I stood entirely alone on the freezing porch. The cherry pie box in my hands suddenly felt absurd, a pathetic symbol of a daughter begging for a love that simply did not exist. The wind howled around me, burying my boots in fresh snow. The intense burning pain of rejection that had threatened to completely break me just moments ago suddenly vanished. In its place, a profound, icy resolve took over my entire being. I did not shed a single tear. Crying would have been a waste of energy, and I had absolutely none left to spare for people who viewed my existence as a liability. I turned my back on the million-dollar mansion, walked down the pristine, snow-covered driveway, and approached my rusted sedan. I opened the passenger side door and gently placed the cherry pie on the frozen leather seat. I then slowly slid into the freezing cabin of the car. My breath plumed in the cold air as I pulled my laptop from my worn canvas tote bag. I rested it on the steering wheel, ignoring the freezing temperature numbing my fingertips. I connected to the public wireless network broadcasting from the nearby country club. The bright screen illuminated the dark car, casting a pale, determined light across my face. I opened my email client. In the drafts folder was the final pitch deck for my artificial intelligence auditing software, a project I had poured my soul into for the past 12 months. The email was addressed to the senior partners of a major venture capital firm in Silicon Valley, known for funding the most aggressive, disruptive tech startups in the industry. I had hesitated to send it earlier, plagued by the constant self-doubt my family had instilled in me. I had constantly worried my work was not good enough, that I was exactly the failure my father claimed I was. But sitting in the freezing dark, fresh from the ultimate betrayal, that self-doubt evaporated entirely. My father had demanded I leave because I had no value. He had chosen a cheating ex-boyfriend and a hedge fund manager over his own daughter because they represented power. I stared at the pitch deck on my screen, realizing that this software was my ticket out of their shadow. It was my weapon, my absolute leverage, and my future. I did not hesitate for a second. I moved the cursor over the send button and firmly tapped the trackpad. The progress bar flashed briefly before the screen confirmed the email had been successfully delivered. I closed the laptop and started the engine. As I drove away from the mansion, leaving the illusion of my family behind in the blinding snowstorm, I felt a dangerous, quiet smile spread across my face. They wanted me to go away and never amount to anything. Instead, I was going to build an empire that would eventually swallow theirs whole. The morning sun pierced through the frost-covered windows of my beat-up sedan, casting a harsh, glaring light across my face. I had not driven all the way back to my apartment after leaving the mansion. Instead, I had parked in a desolate strip mall lot, letting the heater run until the gas tank warning light flickered on and forced me to turn the engine off. My neck was incredibly stiff from sleeping at an awkward angle against the driver's side window, and my entire body ached with a deep, bone-chilling cold. I slowly sat up, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and grabbed my phone from the dashboard. The screen lit up, displaying the date. December 25th, Christmas morning. For families across the country, this was a time of joy and tearing open wrapping paper. For me, it was a stark reminder of my absolute isolation. I opened my banking application, forcing myself to face the grim reality of my financial situation. The screen loaded, and the numbers flashed in a bright, angry red. My balance was severely overdrawn, standing at -$68.42. The automated overdraft fees had hit exactly at midnight, dragging me further down into an inescapable pit of debt. My credit cards were entirely maxed out, and my next rent payment was due in less than a week. I had absolutely no safety net to catch my fall. Just as I was calculating how many packets of instant ramen I could buy with the loose change scattered in my cup holder, my phone vibrated intensely in my frozen hands. A notification popped up on the cracked screen. It was a message from my mother, Catherine. For a fleeting, desperate fraction of a second, my foolish heart leaped. I thought that maybe the harsh light of morning had brought her some clarity. I thought maybe she realized how incredibly cruel they had been to lock me out in a blizzard while feasting with my cheating ex-boyfriend. I opened the message expecting an apology, or at least a minimal attempt at damage control. Instead, the text read, "Sent you $50 for breakfast. Please stop this startup delusion and get a real job. Your father is still furious, but we do not want you starving on the streets like a common vagrant." I stared at the illuminated words until they blurred. There was no warmth, no motherly concern, and certainly no apology. It was pure condescension wrapped in a pathetic $50 digital transfer. It was not a gesture of love. It was a calculated insult designed to assert her absolute dominance and remind me of my lowly place in their hierarchy. That $50 pity charity was the final undeniable straw that broke the camel's back. Sitting in that freezing car clutching a phone that held a $50 insult, I experienced a profound psychological shift. The desperate, aching need for my family's approval that had chained me down for 33 years completely shattered. I finally realized that hoping for their love was actively destroying my life. Every time I reached out, I was handing them a knife to carve away another piece of my self-esteem. I refused to bleed for them anymore. I opened my banking application and immediately rejected the $50 transfer, sending it right back into my mother's account. Then I opened my contacts list. I found Catherine's name and firmly tapped the block button. I did the exact same thing for my father, Jonathan. I found Melanie and Cameron and blocked their numbers too. I did not stop there. I opened every single social media platform I had and systematically blocked their profiles. I blocked Jamal. I blocked Brad. I severed every digital tie, every possible avenue they could use to inject their toxic poison into my life. When the final block was confirmed, a massive, suffocating weight lifted off my chest. I was entirely alone, but for the first time in my entire life, I was completely free. I started the car using the last fumes of gas to drive back to my cramped apartment. The next 6 months became an absolute blur of relentless, agonizing labor. I transformed my tiny living room into a makeshift command center. I dragged a mattress onto the floor directly next to my desk so I would not waste a single second transitioning between sleeping and working. My daily routine was stripped down to the barest essentials of human survival. I woke up at 4 in the morning, drank a cup of cheap, bitter instant coffee, and immediately began writing code. I worked grueling 18-hour days staring at multiple monitors until my vision blurred and my eyes burned. My diet consisted entirely of boiled tap water and 40-cent ramen noodles. I lost weight, my cheekbones became sharp and prominent, and dark, heavy bags formed permanently under my eyes. But my mind was sharper than it had ever been. The memory of Brad smirking in my father's leather chair fueled my every keystroke. Every time I felt exhausted, every time I wanted to collapse and give up, I remembered the sound of that heavy oak door slamming in my face. I channeled every ounce of my anger, every shred of my trauma, into the architecture of my artificial intelligence program. My software was designed to act as an automated financial auditor, utilizing advanced machine learning to detect anomalies, discrepancies, and hidden liabilities within massive corporate databases. It was complex, intricate, and incredibly demanding to build. For months, I battled severe bug system crashes and algorithmic logic failures that threatened to derail the entire project. But as winter melted into spring, and spring burned into summer, the pieces finally began to click together. My relentless dedication started paying off. The neural network I had designed began processing data at an unprecedented speed. I ran a massive stress test feeding the program simulated financial records from a hypothetical failing logistics company. I watched with bated breath as the progress bar raced across the screen. The system processed millions of data points in mere seconds, cross-referencing ledgers identifying shadow accounts and flagging high-risk investments with absolute pinpoint accuracy. The final report generated flawlessly, highlighting exactly where the simulated company was bleeding money. There were no crashes, no errors, and no glitches. The AI was working perfectly. I sat back on the floor of my apartment staring at the pristine, glowing results on my monitor. The software was no longer a delusion or a cute hobby. It was a fully functional, highly aggressive technological weapon, and I was finally ready to deploy it to the world. 3 months later, the suffocating heat of my cramped apartment was replaced by the frigid, hyper-conditioned air of a glass-walled boardroom in Silicon Valley. I stood at the head of a massive mahogany table, wearing a sharp, tailored suit I had bought at a consignment shop the day before my flight. Across from me sat Diana, a legendary venture capitalist whose name struck fear and awe into the hearts of tech founders across the globe. Diana was known for being entirely ruthless. She had a reputation for dismantling pitches within the first 2 minutes and throwing founders out of her office if they wasted her time. She sat perfectly still, her piercing gray eyes locked onto my presentation deck, her posture radiating an intimidating no-nonsense authority. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird, but my voice remained steady and projected absolute confidence. I walked Diana through the core architecture of my artificial intelligence program. I explained how the software was meticulously designed to instantly detect financial fraud, trace complex embezzlement schemes, and expose massive supply chain inefficiencies. I projected a live simulation onto the enormous screen behind me, feeding the program raw encrypted data from a massive hypothetical corporation. The AI went to work immediately. Within seconds, the screen lit up with red flags isolating shadow accounts, exposing fabricated vendor invoices and highlighting millions of dollars in hidden liabilities. It did in 15 seconds what a team of senior forensic accountants would take 6 months to uncover. I watched Diana closely. For the first 10 minutes of my presentation, she had not shown a single micro-expression. But as the final comprehensive audit report flashed onto the screen, flawlessly categorizing the simulated corporate rot, I saw her posture shift. She leaned forward, resting her elbows on the polished mahogany table, and steepled her fingers. A faint glimmer of genuine intrigue sparked in her gray eyes. She asked me highly technical questions about the machine learning algorithms and the server load capacities. I answered each one with rapid-fire precision, firing back data points and security protocols without hesitation. I knew every single line of code in that software because I had bled over it for the last year. Diana slowly nodded, a gesture that felt like winning an Olympic gold medal in the venture capital world. She stated that my software was aggressive, disruptive, and had the potential to completely decimate the traditional financial auditing industry. She picked up a solid gold pen and tapped it thoughtfully against her leather portfolio. She leaned back and said she was prepared to discuss a multi-million-dollar seed investment to immediately scale my operations. A wave of euphoric relief washed over me, so intense my knees briefly threatened to buckle. My 18-hour workdays, my starvation diet, my absolute isolation, it was all finally paying off. I was standing on the precipice of building an empire. But right as I opened my mouth to negotiate terms, the heavy glass door of the boardroom swung open. Diana's executive assistant stepped into the room clutching a sleek silver tablet. The assistant walked briskly over to Diana, completely ignoring me, and placed the tablet directly in front of her. The assistant leaned down and whispered urgently into Diana's ear. I watched as the temperature in the room plummeted. The glimmer of intrigue in Diana's eyes vanished instantly, replaced by a cold, impenetrable wall of suspicion. She set her gold pen down carefully on the table. The silence stretched out thick and suffocating. Diana stared at the glowing screen of the tablet for what felt like an eternity before slowly shifting her gaze back to me. She stated that she operated her firm on a foundation of absolute transparency and trust. She told me that her assistant continuously monitored a secure internal server for background intelligence on prospective founders during final pitch meetings. She turned the tablet around and pushed it across the smooth mahogany surface toward me. She coldly commanded me to read the email that had been sent directly to her private inbox just 2 hours prior. I stepped forward and looked down at the screen. It was an anonymous email sent from an encrypted server. The subject line read, "Urgent warning regarding Sydney and the AI auditing pitch." My stomach violently dropped as I read the body of the message. The email was a vicious, meticulously crafted smear campaign. It claimed that I was completely unhinged and severely mentally unstable. It falsely stated that I had fabricated my testing data and stolen the core algorithmic logic from a former employer. It warned Diana that investing in my company would result in a massive public relations disaster because I was a chronic liar who lacked any fundamental business acumen. But it was not the blatant lies that made my blood run cold. It was the specific vocabulary. The email described my drive as a pathetic, struggling energy. It called my ambition a toxic delusion. It specifically highlighted my inability to handle high-pressure environments, labeling me a highly emotional liability who would inevitably crack. I knew those words. I knew the cadence, the cruel rhythm of those exact phrases. They were the same words that had been weaponized against me in my own apartment. They were the same insults hurled at me on that freezing porch on Christmas Eve. The sender had tried to mask their identity, but the arrogant, vindictive tone was a dead giveaway. It was Brad. My cheating ex-boyfriend had somehow discovered that I was pitching to Diana's firm today. He had likely used his new network, his lucrative connections with my father, to track my movements and sabotage my one chance at success. He was sitting thousands of miles away in Chicago, actively trying to destroy my life all over again, simply because he could not stand the thought of me succeeding without him. Diana leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed tightly. She bluntly asked me if there was any truth to the allegations on that screen. She stated that if I was bringing personal baggage or fraudulent code into her firm, the meeting was over and I would be blacklisted from every venture capital office in Silicon Valley by noon. Panic threatened to claw its way up my throat. Brad was trying to steal my future from afar, turning my greatest triumph into ashes. I looked away from the tablet and met Diana's piercing gaze. I knew that if I showed even a fraction of the emotional devastation I was currently feeling, she would instantly believe the email. I had to prove right here and right now that I was not the fragile, shattered woman Brad claimed I was. I took a deep breath, forced my heart rate to slow, and prepared to fight for my life. I pushed the sleek silver tablet back across the smooth mahogany table, ensuring my hand remained perfectly steady. I did not offer a tearful denial. I did not launch into a frantic emotional explanation about my deeply toxic family dynamic or the vindictive nature of my cheating ex-boyfriend. I knew a woman like Diana did not care about personal drama. She cared exclusively about tangible results, empirical data, and undeniable proof. I looked directly into her piercing gray eyes, and told her that anyone with a keyboard could write a slanderous email, but numbers never lied. I asked her for exactly 3 minutes of her time and explicit permission to run a live unscripted audit using my software on a real-world target of my choosing. Diana stared at me in heavy silence, analyzing my utter lack of panic. She was searching for a crack in my armor, a sign that the email had exposed a fatal flaw in my character. Finding none, she slowly nodded and gestured toward my laptop with a single sharp movement of her hand. I turned back to my keyboard. My fingers flew across the keys as I completely bypassed my own safely contained simulated environment. I connected the artificial intelligence directly to the live global financial registry, bypassing the safety rails I usually kept in place for standard demonstrations. I did not choose a random corporate entity. I specifically targeted the newly formed real estate holding company that Brad had recently launched with my father. I pulled up publicly available tax records, state incorporation filings, and standard vendor cross-references. I fed this raw, disorganized data directly into my software's primary intake portal. The boardroom was dead silent, except for the frantic, rhythmic clicking of my mechanical keyboard. I calmly explained to Diana that the sender of that anonymous email claimed my software was fraudulent and my core logic was fundamentally flawed. I told her I was going to demonstrate exactly what my algorithm could do to a live entity without any pre-programmed parameters. I moved the cursor and firmly hit the execute command. The massive presentation screen behind me went entirely black for a fraction of a second. The processing sequence began. The progress bar did not crawl or stutter. It practically teleported across the bottom of the screen. In exactly 3.2 seconds, the system chimed loudly, echoing through the cavernous boardroom. The black screen instantly exploded into a highly detailed interactive financial web. It was not just a basic spreadsheet or a standard audit report. It was a complete forensic dissection of Brad's entire business operation laid bare for the world to see. The artificial intelligence had instantly flagged a massive, intricate web of severe tax evasion. Bright red digital lines traced heavy streams of capital flowing directly from Brad's domestic real estate shell company into heavily guarded offshore holding accounts located in the Cayman Islands. The software had automatically cross-referenced his submitted vendor invoices and discovered they were entirely fabricated. The program linked his payments back to empty warehouse addresses and ghost corporations that did not actually exist anywhere on a map. The system highlighted clear, undeniable evidence of aggressive embezzlement, showing exactly how funds were being systematically siphoned out of his business partnerships, including his new venture with my father, and masked as exorbitant consulting fees. I stepped aside so Diana had a completely unobstructed view of the sprawling financial crime currently displayed on the monitor. I kept my voice incredibly level and professional. I told her that the man who sent her that slanderous email to ruin my reputation was currently running a massive fraudulent enterprise. I explained that my software had just dismantled his entire illicit operation and traced millions of dollars in stolen funds in less than 4 seconds using only publicly available data fragments and advanced predictive modeling. I waited for the reality of the situation to set in. Diana did not gasp. She did not express moral shock or outrage at the massive criminal implications displayed on her wall. Instead, she stood up from her heavy leather chair and walked slowly toward the massive screen. Her gray eyes traced the complex digital pathways and the offshore routing numbers my software had effortlessly mapped out. She reached out and touched the screen, verifying the data links and the algorithmic logic paths. When she finally turned back to face me, her entire expression had transformed. The cold, impenetrable wall of suspicion was completely gone. It was replaced by a fierce, terrifyingly calculating hunger. She realized the absolute monumental power of what I had built in my tiny freezing apartment. She recognized that a tool this efficient, this brutally accurate, could bring entire corrupt corporate empires to their knees overnight. She saw the future of financial security, and she knew I held the only key. Diana walked briskly back to her seat and picked up her solid gold pen. She looked at me with a newfound profound respect. She stated clearly that she did not care who I had angered to prompt that desperate email. She said that my personal life and my enemies were entirely my own business, but my software was unequivocally the most destructive, beautiful piece of technology she had seen in a decade. She slammed her leather portfolio shut with a loud, definitive smack. She looked me dead in the eyes and offered me $5 million in initial seed funding on the spot. She promised immediate access to her top-tier legal team to aggressively protect my intellectual property and ensure no one could ever steal my code. She demanded a 20% equity stake and a seat on my board of directors. The emotional baggage, the trauma of the freezing snow, the endless nights of eating cheap noodles and crying over my keyboard all vanished in that single triumphant moment. I had walked into that room a struggling outcast, and I was walking out a multimillionaire tech founder with the ultimate weapon to destroy the people who had tried to bury me. I looked at Diana, offered a firm professional smile, and told her we had a deal. I looked at Diana, offered a firm professional smile, and told her we had a deal. That single handshake in the hyper-conditioned Silicon Valley boardroom was the ignition switch that fundamentally altered the trajectory of my entire existence. The $5 million seed funding hit my newly formed corporate bank account less than 48 hours later. I immediately packed up my few belongings, left my cramped, freezing apartment, and relocated to a sleek glass corner office in downtown San Francisco. The agonizing 18-hour days of surviving on cheap ramen noodles and tap water were instantly replaced by catered executive lunches and endless strategy meetings with top-tier corporate legal teams. Over the next 8 months, my life became an absolute whirlwind of aggressive scaling, relentless market domination, and flawless execution. The artificial intelligence software I had built on a mattress on my floor was no longer just a theoretical pitch or a vindictive weapon against my ex-boyfriend. It became a terrifying reality for corrupt financial institutions and inefficient corporate structures across the globe. Diana heavily leveraged her immense network to secure closed-door demonstrations with the largest banking conglomerates in the world. Once those cynical executives saw my algorithm dissect their most complex labyrinthine ledgers in a matter of seconds, they were practically throwing lucrative contracts at me. By the end of spring, my technology was being officially integrated into the primary auditing systems of 3 major international banks. My software was aggressively hunting down hidden liabilities, exposing massive supply chain inefficiencies, and neutralizing complex fraud schemes with a brutal accuracy that human accountants could never possibly match. As summer approached, the mainstream financial press began to catch wind of the phantom software completely disrupting Wall Street. My company was no longer a secret weapon or a niche startup. It was rapidly becoming an industry titan. After a highly publicized Series A funding round, led entirely by Diana's aggressive venture capital firm, my corporate valuation skyrocketed to an astronomical $150 million. I was exactly 33 years old, and I was standing at the absolute helm of a technological empire. My company was generating more legitimate, sustainable revenue in a single business quarter than my father's struggling logistics firm had seen in the last decade. Exactly 8 months after my family had locked me out in a brutal Chicago blizzard, I found myself stepping out of a chauffeur-driven black car and onto the crimson carpet of the San Francisco Tech Innovation Summit. The warm California evening breeze brushed gently against my face, providing a stark, beautiful contrast to the icy, biting wind that had once threatened to break my spirit entirely. Flashbulbs erupted in a blinding continuous wave as paparazzi and eager financial journalists clamored for a shot of the industry's newest unicorn founder. The venue was a sprawling, opulent glass pavilion overlooking the sparkling bay filled with the absolute elite of the global technology sector. I walked through the heavy grand doors radiating a quiet, impenetrable power. I was no longer the invisible scapegoat huddled in a frayed thrift store coat, begging for scraps of affection. Tonight, I was wearing a meticulously tailored custom white suit that cost more than my entire previous college tuition. The crisp, structured lines of the bright fabric symbolized a complete rebirth, an undeniable statement of absolute authority and unshakable confidence. I moved through the crowded ballroom with effortless grace, exchanging firm handshakes and sharp business insights with legendary tech billionaires and highly influential venture capitalists who treated me as an absolute equal. Halfway through the glamorous evening, the massive crystal chandeliers dimmed gracefully, and a commanding voice echoed over the state-of-the-art sound system. I was formally called to the main stage to accept the highly coveted award for Top Tech Innovators Under 35. The applause that filled the cavernous room was deafening, a roaring validation of every single solitary sacrifice I had ever made in my life. I walked up the illuminated glass steps and stood at the center of the stage, bathed in a brilliant, warm spotlight. I accepted the heavy geometric glass trophy, looking out at a sea of the most powerful people in the world, who were all giving me a prolonged standing ovation. As I posed for the official press photograph standing shoulder to shoulder with two legendary industry titans, I offered a sharp, confident smile directly into the blinding camera lenses. That specific image perfectly captured the exact moment of my ultimate triumph. I looked radiant, untouchable, and fiercely powerful in my bright white suit, gripping the heavy crystal award. Within 24 hours, that single photograph exploded across the internet like a digital shockwave. It was prominently featured on the digital front page of Forbes magazine under a massive bold headline detailing my $150 million valuation and my rapid ascent to the top of the tech world. The image spread like absolute wildfire across LinkedIn, generating hundreds of thousands of likes, comments, and shares from global executives and aspiring entrepreneurs. The viral momentum was entirely unstoppable. My face, my name, and my monumental financial success were suddenly plastered across every major financial news outlet and corporate social media feed on the planet. I sat in my luxury penthouse suite overlooking the San Francisco skyline, sipping premium sparkling water, and watching the engagement metrics skyrocket on my digital tablet. I knew with absolute crystalline certainty that the blast radius of this viral moment was massive. The news was spreading far beyond the elite borders of Silicon Valley. It was rapidly making its way across the country, cutting straight through the digital landscape toward a specific affluent suburb in Chicago. The arrogant people who had confidently predicted my complete failure were about to open their morning feeds and choke on my undeniable victory. It took exactly 12 hours for the digital shockwave to reach the manicured lawns of my hometown. I was sitting at the massive marble island in my San Francisco penthouse, enjoying a perfectly brewed espresso when my personal phone began to vibrate violently. It was not my family reaching out directly because their numbers were securely locked behind digital blockades. Instead, it was a sudden, relentless avalanche of messages from old high school acquaintances, former neighbors, and distant cousins. They were frantically forwarding me screenshots of a public social media post that was rapidly gaining traction across our hometown networks. I opened the first image and nearly choked on my hot coffee. It was a screenshot of a massive Facebook tribute posted by my mother, Catherine. The sheer, unadulterated audacity radiating from the screen was absolutely breathtaking. She had attached a heavily edited, grainy photograph of us from my college graduation, completely cropping out the fact that she had been scowling in the original unedited version. Above the photo was a paragraph dripping with the most hypocritical, toxic sweetness imaginable. The text read, "So incredibly proud of my beautiful daughter Sydney, I always knew she was destined for greatness. Watching her tech company reach a $150 million valuation is a mother's greatest dream come true. We always pushed her to reach for the stars. Family first." I stared at the glowing pixels tracing the words "family first" over and over again. The profound delusion required to type those words was practically pathological. This was the exact same woman who had texted me a $50 digital insult and told me to abandon my startup delusion on Christmas morning. This was the woman who had happily served roasted duck to my cheating ex-boyfriend while I was freezing on her front porch. Yet here she was publicly wrapping herself in the glory of my monumental success, desperately trying to rewrite history to position herself as the supportive matriarch of a tech billionaire. She was not apologizing for her cruelty. She was completely erasing it in real time to harvest social currency from her country club friends. A loud, genuine burst of laughter escaped my lips, echoing sharply through the cavernous high ceilings of my penthouse. I laughed until my stomach ached, and tears pricked the corners of my eyes. It was not a bitter laugh, but a deeply cathartic release of absolute amusement. The psychological machinery of a narcissistic family is a terrifyingly predictable thing. When you are struggling, they treat you like a contagious disease, aggressively isolating you to protect their fragile social image. But the absolute second you achieve a level of power or wealth that they can exploit, they will instantly suffer a collective bout of amnesia. They will eagerly step into the spotlight you built, claiming they laid the very foundation you stand on. The screenshots kept pouring in. A former neighbor messaged me asking if I was planning a massive homecoming celebration. Because Catherine was already bragging about a lavish family vacation, I was supposedly financing for them to the Maldives. My mother had already spent my hypothetical money in her head, constructing an elaborate fantasy where we were all best friends again. I swiped away the messages, my amusement slowly morphing into a cold, analytical fascination. I was watching my family behave exactly like the corrupt corporate entities my software was designed to dismantle. They were fabricating emotional ledgers, attempting to claim dividends on an investment they actively tried to destroy. By noon, the desperate attempts to breach my digital fortress escalated significantly. Since my personal phone and private social accounts remained an impenetrable wall, they resorted to professional channels. The primary inbox for my company's public relations department began flagging a series of bizarre incoming emails. My executive assistant walked into my office holding a printed stack of messages, her expression a mixture of deep confusion and professional concern. She placed the papers on my glass desk and gently informed me that several individuals claiming to be my immediate family members were aggressively demanding direct contact with the chief executive officer. I picked up the top sheet of paper. It was an email from my older brother Cameron, the undisputed golden child who had recently gambled away company money and crashed a luxury sports car, was suddenly adopting a tone of deep fraternal concern. His message was incredibly transparent. He claimed he was currently exploring new investment opportunities and wanted to discuss a strategic partnership between my newly minted tech empire and his own vague business ventures. He casually mentioned that Dad was extremely proud and that we should all get together for an expensive steak dinner in Chicago to bury the hatchet. There was absolutely no mention of the Christmas Eve betrayal. There was no acknowledgement of the years of severe emotional abuse. He simply saw a $150 million piggy bank and assumed his DNA granted him an all-access pass to the vault. Beneath Cameron's email was a message forwarded by my recruiting team. It was from Melanie, my fiercely condescending younger sister. The woman who had literally acted as a bouncer to keep me out of my own childhood home was now attempting to leverage my success for her own social climbing. Her message was painfully sycophantic. She wrote that she always knew I was the smart one in the family, and playfully suggested that I hire her as the vice president of public relations for my San Francisco office. She claimed her husband Jamal was incredibly impressed by my market disruption and wanted to invite me to an exclusive charity gala he was hosting next month. She ended the message with a string of heart emojis, completely ignoring the reality that the last time we spoke, she had called me a pathetic stray dog begging for scraps. I leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair, staring at the printed stack of desperate emails. The contrast between my current reality and their pathetic scrambling was stark and deeply satisfying. 8 months ago, they held all the power. They controlled the narrative, the access, and the resources. They used that power to break me down to the absolute lowest point of my entire life. Now the power dynamic had completely inverted. I possessed massive wealth, immense industry influence, and absolute control over my own boundaries. I slowly picked up the stack of papers, held them over my metal wastebasket, and let them slip from my fingers. I watched the frantic demands for my attention flutter harmlessly into the trash. I did not owe them an explanation. I did not owe them a reunion. I certainly did not owe them a single dime of the empire I built with my own two hands. I instructed my executive assistant to permanently block their names and addresses from our corporate servers. The viral news had successfully delivered my absolute triumph to their doorstep, but they would never be allowed inside my new life. The viral news had successfully delivered my absolute triumph to their doorstep, but they would never be allowed inside my new life. My digital fortress was entirely secure, effectively neutralizing their frantic emails and pathetic social media tagging. I had successfully insulated myself from their toxic reach, relying on my executive team to filter out the noise. But in any highly complex system, human error is always the ultimate wildcard. It was a late Tuesday afternoon, and the San Francisco fog was just beginning to roll over the bay, casting a cool gray light through the floor-to-ceiling windows of my office. I was sitting at my desk reviewing the final security integration metrics for a massive European banking client when my private business line began to ring. This specific phone number was highly restricted. It was unlisted, encrypted, and strictly reserved for my board of directors, my legal counsel, and Diana. The caller identification displayed an unknown number originating from a Chicago area code. I frowned slightly, assuming it was a secure routing error, or perhaps a high-level financial executive traveling through the Midwest. I reached out and picked up the receiver. I offered a crisp, professional greeting, but the voice that responded sent a momentary jolt of adrenaline straight into my chest. It was Cameron. My older brother, the undisputed golden child of the family, was on the other end of my highly secure line. His tone was nauseatingly casual, dripping with the same unearned arrogance he had displayed his entire life. He did not sound apologetic. He did not sound like a man whose family had brutally discarded their own blood in the freezing snow just 8 months prior. He sounded exactly like a man walking into a luxury car dealership expecting to be handed the keys for free. He practically shouted my name into the receiver, calling me little sis with an artificial warmth that made my skin crawl. Before I could even ask how he had breached my communications network, he proudly volunteered the information. He gloated about tracking down a junior logistics vendor who supplied the cooling units for my data servers. Cameron had apparently used his fading title at Atlas Logistics to manipulate the young vendor, spinning a fabricated story about a family emergency to extract my direct executive contact information. He treated this massive violation of my corporate privacy as if it were a clever sibling prank. I remained entirely silent, letting him fill the dead air with his overbearing confidence. Cameron quickly transitioned from fake pleasantries to the actual reason for his call. He cleared his throat and adopted a tone he likely thought sounded authoritative and commanding. He told me he had seen the Forbes article and was incredibly impressed by how far my little software project had come. He actually used the word little to describe a company currently valued at $150 million. He stated that while my coding skills were obviously adequate, I clearly lacked the seasoned executive presence required to manage a rapidly scaling corporate enterprise. He told me that Wall Street sharks would eventually eat a fragile emotional woman like me alive if I did not have a strong male figure aggressively managing my financial portfolio. He was completely ignoring the fact that I had just secured $5 million from the most ruthless venture capitalist in Silicon Valley, entirely on my own. Then Cameron presented his formal demand. He did not ask for a job, he aggressively dictated his terms. He informed me that he was officially offering to step in as my chief financial officer to save me from my own inevitable incompetence. But his absolute delusion did not stop at a C-suite executive title. He stated that because we were blood, and because he would be sacrificing his highly valuable time at Atlas Logistics, he expected a 20% equity stake in my entire company. He wanted the exact same equity share that Diana had secured with $5 million in hard capital. Cameron wanted it for absolutely free. I sat perfectly still in my ergonomic leather chair listening to his rapid-fire extortion. He began to justify his absurd demands by weaponizing my childhood. He claimed it was my fundamental duty to pay the family back for everything they had sacrificed to raise me. He listed the food I ate as a child, the pale blue bedroom I hated, and the basic clothing they provided as if they were high-interest loans that had finally come due. He firmly stated that generating generational wealth was a team sport, and it was time for me to stop being so selfish and finally contribute to the family legacy. His monologue stretched on for 3 unbroken minutes. 8 months ago, this exact phone call would have sent me into a severe panic attack. I would have stammered, I would have cried, and I would have desperately tried to explain my worth. I would have let his booming, arrogant voice completely crush my spirit. But sitting in my glass office, wrapped in the impenetrable armor of my own self, made success, I felt absolutely nothing but a cold, analytical detachment. Cameron finally stopped talking, expecting me to eagerly accept his generous offer to take over the empire I had bled to build. The silence on the line stretched out thick and heavy. I looked out the window at the sprawling city below, feeling the immense, unshakable power of being entirely in control. I did not raise my voice. I did not express any anger. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the cool glass surface of my desk, and spoke with absolute icy precision. I asked, "Who is this?" Cameron let out a confused, nervous chuckle. He stammered, repeating his name and reminding me that he was my big brother. I cut him off immediately, my voice dropping to a flat, deadpan tone, completely devoid of any emotion. I said, "I am sorry, my family's mansion does not allow failures through the door. Try Uber." I did not wait for his response. I did not want to hear his inevitable explosion of narcissistic rage or his frantic attempts to backtrack. I firmly pressed the red button on the receiver, instantly severing the connection. I immediately opened my security dashboard, logged the Chicago phone number, and permanently blocked it across all corporate communication channels. I then drafted a rapid internal email to my legal team, directing them to terminate our contract with the junior logistics vendor, who had leaked my information by the end of the business day. I set the phone back down on its receiver. The office was perfectly quiet again. I took a deep, cleansing breath. For 33 years, Cameron had operated under the assumption that he was the superior being simply by right of birth. He had just discovered the terrifying reality that in the actual business world, his unearned arrogance meant absolutely nothing. I had just slammed a multi-million-dollar door directly in his face, and the resounding click of that phone hanging up was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. The beautiful silence of my office lasted for exactly 72 hours. I should have known that cutting off Cameron's ridiculous demands would not be the end of their desperate campaign. When a narcissistic system is denied its expected fuel, it does not simply give up and retreat. It escalates. It regroups and launches a physical offensive. It was 10 in the morning on a bright Thursday. I was standing by my massive glass windows reviewing a digital rendering of our new European server farms when the secure intercom on my desk chimed softly. It was David, my head of corporate security. He was a former military intelligence officer who ran my building with absolute, uncompromising precision. His voice was incredibly calm but laced with a subtle edge of professional annoyance. He informed me that we had a highly irregular situation developing on the ground floor. I walked over to my desk and tapped the security interface on my tablet, bringing up the live closed-circuit camera feed from our main lobby. The visual on the screen made my jaw clench. Standing in the center of my immaculate minimalist corporate lobby, completely surrounded by sleek white marble and armed security personnel, was my family. They had actually flown all the way from Chicago to San Francisco to launch a physical ambush at my corporate headquarters. My father, Jonathan, was aggressively leaning over the main reception desk, his face flushed a deep, angry red. He was pointing a thick finger at my terrified front desk receptionist, clearly attempting to intimidate her into granting him access to the executive elevators. My mother, Catherine, was standing right behind him, executing a sickeningly theatrical performance. She was clutching a designer handbag to her chest and dabbing at her dry eyes with a tissue, playing the role of the deeply distressed, loving mother. She was loudly wailing to anyone who would listen, claiming they had flown across the country because they were terrified for their daughter's mental health. Standing slightly off to the side was my sister Melanie. She was desperately trying to look composed and wealthy in her emerald green dress, but her eyes were constantly darting around the massive lobby. I could practically see the raw, unchecked envy radiating from her posture as she took in the sheer scale of the empire I had built. But they had not come alone. Hovering right behind my father was a man I did not recognize. He was wearing a slightly oversized pinstripe suit that looked entirely out of place in Silicon Valley, holding a scuffed leather briefcase. He had the unmistakable greasy aura of a sleazy corporate lawyer, the kind of man who specialized in aggressive intimidation tactics and frivolous lawsuits. They had brought legal backup, assuming they could legally bully me into submission. David asked if I wanted him to call the local police department and have them formally trespassed from the property. For a fleeting second, the idea of watching my arrogant father and my theatrical mother being escorted out of my building in handcuffs was incredibly tempting. But I quickly dismissed the thought. Kicking them out immediately would only feed their twisted narrative. Catherine would run straight to social media claiming her cruel, ungrateful daughter had called the police on her loving family. I needed to completely neutralize their leverage, and the only way to do that was to expose exactly what they were trying to do. I pressed the intercom button and instructed David not to involve the authorities just yet. Instead, I told him to have his armed guards escort the four of them up to the executive floor, but not into my office. I directed him to place them in conference room B. I wanted them surrounded by my power enclosed in a space where they had absolutely no control. Conference Room B was a massive hyper-modern boardroom, entirely enclosed in thick, soundproof glass. It sat right in the middle of our busiest engineering floor. From inside that room, they would be completely isolated, unable to hear anything, but they would have a front-row seat to the massive, highly coordinated operation I commanded. I did not rush down to meet them. I deliberately took my time. I poured myself a fresh cup of espresso. I answered 3 emails. I reviewed a legal brief. I let them sit in that transparent glass box for 45 agonizing minutes. I watched them on the internal security feed as their initial aggressive confidence slowly morphed into deeply uncomfortable agitation. My father paced the length of the room, checking his expensive watch every 2 minutes. Catherine dropped the crying mother act entirely and sat rigidly in a chair, glaring at the busy software engineers walking past the glass. The sleazy lawyer kept wiping sweat from his forehead, clearly intimidated by the massive scale of the corporate environment he had just walked into. They looked like small, angry trespassers trapped inside a massive, sophisticated machine. When I finally decided they had marinated in their own anxiety long enough, I stood up, smoothed the fabric of my tailored navy suit, and walked out of my office. I moved across the engineering floor with effortless authority. My employees stepped aside, offering respectful nods as I passed. I approached the heavy glass door of Conference Room B, grasped the chrome handle, and pushed it open. The sudden shift in the room's atmosphere was instantaneous. My father stopped pacing and puffed out his chest, attempting to reclaim his usual domineering posture. Catherine immediately forced a painful, artificial smile onto her face. The lawyer scrambled to stand up, clutching his cheap briefcase against his leg. Before any of them could even utter a single word, I walked directly to the head of the long mahogany table. I did not offer them a seat. I did not ask about their flight. I placed my tablet firmly onto the smooth surface and looked at them with a cold, detached curiosity. I was not the terrified girl in the freezing snow anymore. I was the chief executive officer of a $150 million technology firm, and they were trespassing in my domain. I looked directly at the man in the pinstripe suit and demanded he identify himself and state exactly why he was in my building. The lawyer cleared his throat nervously, his eyes darting toward my father for support. He puffed out his chest and stated his name was Richard, attempting to adopt a booming authoritative voice. He claimed he was representing the legal and financial interests of the family. He slapped his hand down on his briefcase, declaring that we were going to have a very serious conversation about intellectual property rights and familial equity compensation. My father stepped forward, a smug, entitled grin spreading across his face. He told me that hiding behind security guards was a cowardly move. He said they had come all the way to Chicago to ensure I did not make any reckless decisions with the family's new technological asset. He had completely ignored reality, still deeply convinced that simply because he was my father, he owned everything I created. I stared at them, the sheer delusion of their ambush washing over me. They truly believed they could march into my fortress, wave a cheap lawyer in my face, and demand the keys to my kingdom. I let a slow, sharp smile spread across my face. I looked at my father and calmly informed him that his geography was as deeply flawed as his business strategy because we were currently standing in San Francisco. Then I turned my attention back to his sweating lawyer, ready to completely dismantle their pathetic corporate play. Richard opened his mouth to speak, his vocal cords visibly straining against his tight collar, but my father abruptly raised a heavy hand, cutting him off. The theatrical, loving father facade that Jonathan had so carefully maintained in the lobby instantly evaporated like water hitting a scorching skillet. The forced warmth in his eyes was rapidly replaced by the cold, calculating glare of a man who viewed human beings entirely as financial assets to be ruthlessly liquidated. He took a heavy, aggressive step toward the mahogany table, invading my physical space with the exact same domineering posture he had used to terrorize our household for decades. He reached inside the breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a single crumpled piece of paper. He slammed it down onto the smooth glass surface of the table with a loud, sharp crack that echoed aggressively inside the soundproof room. He pushed it forcefully toward my side of the table, tapping the center of the page with a thick manicured index finger. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I slowly lowered my gaze to examine the highly dramatic piece of evidence he had traveled 2,000 miles to present. It was a faded bank transfer receipt dated exactly 4 years ago. The amount printed in faint black ink was exactly $500. I stared at the meager sum, feeling a strange mixture of profound disgust and absolute disbelief. 4 years ago, I had been drowning in crippling student debt and mounting medical bills from a severe bout of pneumonia. I had desperately begged my family for a temporary loan to cover my rent, so I would not be evicted into the freezing Chicago winter. My father had eventually wired me the money, but only after forcing me to sit through a humiliating 2-hour lecture about my fundamental worthlessness and my complete failure to launch a proper career. Now he was standing in my multi-million-dollar headquarters, weaponizing that exact same pathetic lifeline. Jonathan leaned his heavy knuckles onto the table, his flushed face hovering just inches from my own. He firmly stated that the receipt was indisputable, documented proof of his early financial backing. He actually had the unmitigated audacity to look me dead in the eye and call that $500 rent assistance a foundational seed investment in my technological enterprise. His voice grew louder, echoing against the thick glass walls as he laid out his extortionate demands. Because he was my initial primary investor, he boldly declared that he was legally and morally entitled to a massive retrospective equity stake. He demanded exactly 30% of my entire company. I did a rapid mental calculation, remaining entirely expressionless. 30% of a $150 million valuation meant my father was demanding $45 million in exchange for a 4-year-old rent check. The sheer pathological greed of the demand was almost intoxicating in its absolute absurdity. He was attempting to execute a hostile corporate takeover based on a $500 transaction that barely covered a week of groceries in this city. Behind him, Melanie shifted her weight, letting out a quiet, sharp scoff of amusement. I glanced past my father's broad shoulder and locked eyes with my sister. She was leaning casually against the sleek white wall of the conference room, wearing an incredibly smug, deeply satisfied smirk. She crossed her arms tightly over her expensive emerald dress, radiating a toxic, triumphant energy. In her mind, the natural order of the universe was finally being restored. The golden child and the patriarch were successfully cornering the rebellious family scapegoat, putting me right back into the submissive, terrified box where they believed I permanently belonged. She offered me a slow, condescending nod, as if to say the game was finally over and I had decisively lost. Catherine remained seated at the long table, her posture rigidly straight, and her expression utterly devoid of any genuine maternal affection. She was watching my face intensely, waiting for the inevitable emotional breakdown they had always been able to trigger in the past. She was eagerly waiting for the tears, the frantic apologies, and the desperate capitulation that had defined my entire childhood. When I remained completely silent, offering absolutely no emotional reaction whatsoever, my father decided to aggressively escalate his tactics. He pounded his heavy fist on the table again, causing his nervous lawyer to physically flinch. Jonathan's voice dropped to a low, menacing growl, designed to strike pure terror into my heart. He explicitly outlined the devastating professional consequences of my potential refusal. If I did not immediately instruct my internal legal team to draft the equity transfer documents, he was fully prepared to launch a full-scale media annihilation campaign. He threatened to go directly to the high-profile journalists who had just published the glowing Forbes article about my rapid ascent. He promised to provide them with a highly fabricated, deeply damaging alternative narrative. He claimed he would publicly accuse me of severe elder financial abuse, stating that I had ruthlessly manipulated my aging parents out of their precious retirement savings to secretly fund my selfish corporate ambitions. But the blackmail did not stop at simple character assassination. He leaned in even closer, his breath smelling sharply of stale coffee and peppermint. He stated he would also accuse me of corporate espionage, alleging that I had illegally stolen proprietary logistical data from Atlas Logistics and used it as the foundational architecture for my artificial intelligence software. It was an absolute masterclass in narcissistic extortion. He was openly threatening to completely destroy my pristine industry reputation, my massive corporate valuation, and my personal freedom if I did not hand him a $45 million ransom. The lawyer, Richard, finally found his courage and chimed in, puffing out his narrow chest. He smugly warned me that defending against these types of public allegations, even if they were entirely baseless, would cost my young company millions of dollars in highly publicized legal fees and cause my conservative new banking clients to panic and withdraw their massive contracts. Richard confidently stated that it was simply good business to settle the matter quietly today and keep the immense wealth within the family. The silence in the glass room stretched out thick and suffocating. My family stood there practically vibrating with greedy anticipation, entirely convinced they had executed a flawless strategic checkmate. They had surrounded me in my own fortress, cornered me with aggressive legal threats, and weaponized my painful past against me. They fully expected me to shatter under the immense pressure and hand over the keys to the empire I had bled to build. I slowly picked up the faded $500 receipt, holding it delicately between my thumb and forefinger. I looked at the crinkled paper, studying the cheap ink, and then I slowly looked up at my father's flushed, triumphant face. I did not feel any fear. I did not feel intimidated by his booming voice, his sleazy lawyer, or my mother's piercing glare. Sitting in the center of the empire, I built entirely on my own, I felt nothing but an overwhelming sense of crystalline clarity. They had just handed me the exact weapon I needed to destroy them completely. I did not break eye contact with my father as I slowly released the crinkled receipt, letting it flutter harmlessly back onto the smooth glass surface of the conference table. The suffocating silence in the room was exactly what I wanted. I needed them to feel the absolute height of their unearned confidence before I completely shattered it. I turned away from Jonathan and walked casually toward the far end of the boardroom, where the master control console was seamlessly integrated into the white marble wall. I tapped a single illuminated icon on the glass panel. Instantly, the heavy mechanical blinds descended over the floor-to-ceiling windows, plunging the room into a cool, cinematic darkness. The massive smart screen that covered the entire back wall flared to life, casting a sharp blue glow across the terrified faces of my family. I synced my encrypted digital tablet to the mainframe, and with a simple swipe of my finger, I projected my father's pathetic piece of evidence onto the massive screen. The $500 bank receipt was now magnified 100 times, hovering over them like a digital monument to their profound ignorance. I turned back to face the table, my voice echoing with clinical, icy precision. I told Jonathan that his memory of that freezing winter was incredibly selective. I reminded him that I knew exactly what kind of man he was even back then. I knew that accepting even a single penny from him would be permanently weaponized against me for the rest of my natural life. Because I understood his pathological need for control, I had taken extreme legal precautions. I tapped my tablet again. The screen shifted instantly. Displayed right next to his faded bank receipt was a high-resolution scan of a legally binding microloan agreement. It was dated exactly 4 years ago, the exact same day he had wired me the money. I read the highlighted clauses aloud, letting the dense legal jargon wash over the room. The document clearly defined the $500 not as a seed investment, not as a familial gift, and certainly not as equity capital. It was explicitly categorized as a short-term personal loan with a severely inflated 10% interest rate. And right there at the bottom of the projected document was Jonathan's own aggressive, messy signature. My father's face went entirely slack. The flushed, angry red of his complexion drained away, leaving a sickening pale gray in its wake. He opened his mouth to speak, but absolutely no sound came out. He stared at his own signature magnified on the wall, realizing that his entire extortion plot was built on a foundation of easily disprovable lies. But I was not finished. I swiped the screen a third time. A final document materialized alongside the others. It was an official banking wire confirmation from my own checking account, securely routed directly to Atlas Logistics. The date stamp was exactly 14 days after the initial loan. The amount transferred was exactly $550, covering the principal amount and his predatory interest rate in full. I had repaid the debt completely, severing any financial or legal ties he could ever claim to possess over me. I looked directly at Richard, the sweating lawyer who was rapidly realizing the catastrophic mistake he had just made. I walked slowly toward his side of the table, projecting absolute lethal authority. I calmly informed him that my entire corporate headquarters was heavily monitored by advanced audio and visual recording software for security purposes. I told him that every single word of his aggressive extortion attempt, his threats of media defamation, and his baseless demands for $45 million had just been permanently archived on my secure servers. I leaned over the table, locking eyes with the terrified attorney. I asked him if he was fully aware of the severe penal codes regarding attempted corporate blackmail using completely fabricated financial narratives. I asked him how quickly he thought he would be disbarred when my massive team of elite corporate litigators forwarded this recording directly to the State Bar Association. Richard did not hesitate for a single second. The cheap arrogance he had walked in with evaporated completely. He aggressively snapped his scuffed leather briefcase shut, his hands visibly shaking. He did not look at my father. He did not say goodbye. He simply muttered a frantic, desperate apology to me, threw Jonathan completely under the bus by claiming his client had lied to him about the financial documents, and practically ran out of the glass conference room. With their legal muscle retreating down the hallway in a blind panic, the psychological collapse of my family was instantaneous and entirely beautiful to witness. Melanie's smug, toxic smirk melted into an expression of raw, unadulterated horror. She instinctively took a step back, pressing her spine flat against the white wall, as if she could physically merge into the architecture and disappear. Catherine immediately attempted to change tactics, desperately trying to pivot back to the loving mother routine. She forced a wet, hysterical laugh, waving her hands in the air. She stammered that this was all just a huge, silly misunderstanding, and that they were simply trying to ensure I was financially protected. I cut her off with a single sharp motion of my hand. I told her to save her pathetic theatrical performances for her country club friends because the audience in this room was officially closed. I turned my attention entirely back to Jonathan. He was physically trembling now, gripping the edge of the glass table to keep his balance. The dominant alpha male who had terrorized my entire existence was completely broken, staring at the massive screen that proved his ultimate defeat. I walked right up to him, invading his personal space, just as he had done to me minutes earlier. I was significantly shorter than him, but in that moment I felt like a towering absolute giant. I leaned in close, keeping my voice deadly quiet, so only he could hear the true weight of my words. I told him that before he ever decided to threaten my highly protected corporate empire again, he might want to take a very close look at his own sinking ship. I let a cold, sharp smile touch my lips. I casually mentioned that my advanced auditing software was currently running a massive beta test for several elite financial institutions. I locked eyes with him and dropped the final devastating blow. I suggested he look into Atlas Logistics because I had heard on very good authority that Jamal's hedge fund was currently auditing his entire fragile supply chain. The physical reaction was immediate. Jonathan gasped, a wet, rattling sound escaping his throat. His eyes widened in absolute sheer terror. Jamal was Melanie's husband, his own son-in-law, and a ruthless financial manager. The realization that my technology and my influence were already quietly dismantling his corrupt business from the inside, entirely outflanking him before he even knew we were at war, completely broke him. I did not give him a chance to respond. I firmly pressed the secure intercom button on my desk. Within 3 seconds, David and 4 highly trained armed security officers stepped into the boardroom. I did not look at my family again. I simply instructed David to escort the unauthorized individuals out of my building and ensure they were permanently banned from the entire corporate campus. I turned my back to them and walked out of the glass room, leaving them to be marched out of my empire in absolute humiliating defeat. The immediate aftermath of their expulsion from my corporate fortress was a masterclass in silent psychological devastation. The 2,000-mile flight back to Chicago was entirely devoid of the toxic, arrogant confidence they had carried with them on the journey west. My father stared blankly out the small oval window of the commercial airplane, his knuckles completely white as he gripped the armrests. My mother, Catherine, drank 3 miniature bottles of vodka in rapid succession, desperately trying to numb the profound humiliation of being publicly escorted out of a building by armed security guards. Melanie sat rigidly in her aisle seat, entirely consumed by the terrifying implications of the single parting sentence I had dropped regarding her husband Jamal. Jonathan had spent his entire adult life projecting the aggressive illusion of absolute financial invincibility. He had ruled his family and his business with an iron fist, demanding total submission while quietly hiding the massive structural rot eating away at the foundation of Atlas Logistics. For years, the company had been bleeding capital. He had covered the massive deficits by severely cutting employee benefits, delaying vendor payments, and quietly taking on predatory high-interest loans. His ultimate salvation, his grand master plan, was supposed to be a massive capital injection from his own son-in-law. Jamal managed a highly aggressive regional hedge fund, and Jonathan had successfully manipulated him into securing a multi-million-dollar buyout under the guise of an exclusive family partnership. That Monday morning, Jonathan arrived at the Atlas Logistics corporate headquarters, desperately clinging to the hope that my parting words were just an empty bluff. He parked his heavily leased luxury sedan in his reserved space and walked into his dark wood-paneled office, expecting to find the finalized investment contracts waiting on his desk. Instead, he found a devastating corporate ambush waiting in his primary conference room. Jamal had not sent the final paperwork. He had sent a specialized team of 7 ruthless forensic accountants. When Jonathan pushed open the boardroom doors, he did not see friendly family partners. He saw a highly coordinated tactical strike team armed with encrypted laptops and thick stacks of subpoenaed bank records. The lead auditor, a sharp, cold man in a gray suit, stood up and formally announced that the hedge fund was initiating an immediate and entirely non-negotiable deep dive audit of every single ledger Atlas Logistics had produced over the last decade. They were not releasing a single penny of the promised investment capital until they had independently verified every single asset and liability on the company books. Panic instantly seized my father's chest. He attempted to deploy his usual blustering intimidation tactics, puffing out his chest and angrily demanding to speak directly to Jamal on the phone. He shouted that this was an insulting violation of family trust and threatened to kill the entire deal on the spot. The lead auditor remained completely unfazed by the theatrical display of toxic aggression. He calmly pushed a printed email across the table. It was a direct directive from Jamal stating that the financial irregularities discovered during their initial background checks were so severe that proceeding without a forensic audit would constitute severe fiduciary negligence. The dismantling of Jonathan's fragile empire happened with terrifying mechanical speed. The forensic team completely commandeered the corporate network. They seized my father's hard drives, locked down the physical filing cabinets, and began systematically ripping apart the elaborate web of financial lies he had constructed. It did not take them months to find the rot. It took them less than 48 hours. By Wednesday afternoon, the hedge fund auditors had uncovered a catastrophic labyrinth of corporate fraud. They found the massive hidden debts Jonathan had deliberately kept off the official balance sheets. They discovered a shocking series of offshore shell accounts used to artificially inflate the company's quarterly revenue. Most damning of all, they uncovered clear, documented evidence of Cameron's rampant corporate embezzlement. The Golden Child had been quietly siphoning hundreds of thousands of dollars from the payroll accounts to cover his massive illegal sports gambling debts, and Jonathan had been illegally reclassifying those stolen funds as legitimate operational expenses. The house of cards was not just collapsing, it was instantly disintegrating into fine dust. The absolute final death blow arrived on Thursday morning, completely independent of the hedge fund's audit. While Jonathan was locked in his office, desperately screaming at his incompetent legal team, his nervous executive assistant walked in carrying a single piece of certified mail. The envelope bore the unmistakable official seal of the Internal Revenue Service. The federal government had been quietly alerted to the massive discrepancies between the company's reported income and their actual banking deposits. The sudden, intense financial scrambling caused by the hedge fund audit had triggered multiple automated red flags within the federal banking system. The letter formally notified Jonathan that Atlas Logistics was now the target of a comprehensive federal tax investigation regarding severe payroll tax evasion and corporate fraud. The illusion of power was officially dead. The predatory patriarch who had ruthlessly discarded his own daughter for asking for basic human empathy was now staring down the barrel of total financial ruin and potential federal prison time. 50 miles away in the affluent manicured suburbs, the devastating reality of their collapse was about to hit the family mansion. Catherine was sitting in her lavish sunroom, entirely oblivious to the nuclear detonation happening at the corporate office. She was sipping expensive imported tea and aggressively organizing an upcoming charity luncheon at her exclusive country club, desperately trying to maintain her delicate social standing in the wake of the California disaster. The heavy oak front door of the mansion suddenly violently slammed open. Catherine spilled hot tea onto her designer silk blouse as Jonathan staggered into the grand foyer. He did not look like the arrogant, domineering master of the house anymore. His expensive suit jacket was discarded. His silk tie was completely undone, and his face was the color of wet ash. He looked small, terrified, and profoundly old. Catherine rushed into the hallway, demanding to know why he was home in the middle of the day and complaining about the stain on her blouse. Jonathan slowly raised his head, looking at the extravagant crystal chandelier hanging above them, the expensive imported rugs beneath their feet, and the sweeping grand staircase that symbolized their unearned wealth. His voice was completely hollow, a raspy, breathless whisper devoid of all its former booming authority. He told her that the hedge fund had completely pulled the investment capital. He told her about the forensic accountants, the discovered embezzlement, and the certified letter from the federal government. He watched Catherine's perfectly manicured face contort in absolute raw horror as he delivered the final devastating verdict. He told her the company was completely bankrupt, the bank was inevitably going to foreclose on the mansion, and they were officially ruined. The toxic ecosystem they had violently protected for decades had finally collapsed, completely crushing them under its massive weight. The oppressive silence that followed Jonathan's confession hung in the grand foyer like a suffocating heavy blanket. Catherine stared at the imported marble tiles, unable to process the sheer magnitude of the catastrophe her husband had just delivered. But the true scope of the devastation had not even been fully unearthed yet. 72 hours later, the forensic accounting team deployed by Jamal finalized their comprehensive audit report. The document they produced was not a standard financial summary or a polite internal review. It was a dense 400-page legal indictment detailing a staggering level of corporate malfeasance that went far beyond mere financial mismanagement. The rotting core of Atlas Logistics was finally dragged directly into the harsh, unforgiving light. Jamal did not deliver these catastrophic findings over a polite phone call or a private family dinner. He summoned Jonathan and Cameron to his sleek downtown hedge fund headquarters, stripping them of any remaining familial dignity. When the two men walked into the heavily secured boardroom, they were greeted by Jamal, his lead corporate legal counsel, and a massive stack of printed ledgers that represented their absolute inescapable doom. Jamal was no longer the respectful son-in-law playing the role of a supportive business partner. His face was a mask of cold, calculated fury. He tossed a thick bound folder across the polished table, aiming it directly at Cameron's chest. He demanded in a voice devoid of all warmth that the golden boy open it and explain exactly where $12 million in corporate liquidity had vanished. Cameron visibly shrank into his tailored expensive suit, his arrogant swagger entirely evaporating in the freezing air of the boardroom. The forensic audit had aggressively traced the missing funds, uncovering a desperate, pathetic digital trail that proved entirely fatal. As the official vice president of finance, Cameron had unfettered administrative access to the primary operational accounts of Atlas Logistics. Over the past 3 years, he had not just been siphoning petty cash for luxury cars or covering minor sports betting debts. He had actively engaged in high-risk, margin-leveraged cryptocurrency trading. Convinced of his own unearned financial genius, he had systematically drained nearly $12 million of company payroll vendor payments and emergency cash reserves into highly volatile offshore digital exchanges. When the crypto markets inevitably crashed, his entire portfolio was violently liquidated in a matter of hours, wiping out a decade of legitimate corporate profits. But the sickening revelation did not end with Cameron's astronomical stupidity. The forensic auditors had dug even deeper, uncovering the desperate criminal lengths Jonathan had gone to in order to protect his flawless chosen heir. When Jonathan first discovered the massive $12 million crater in his company accounts, he did not fire Cameron. He did not strip him of his executive title or report the catastrophic theft to the proper authorities. Instead, the patriarch who had ruthlessly discarded his own daughter into a freezing blizzard for asking for basic rent assistance decided to orchestrate a massive illegal cover-up to save his son from federal prison. Jonathan had actively instructed the senior accounting department to falsify quarterly revenue reports, cooking the official books with an aggressive precision that constituted severe federal fraud. To keep the logistics company artificially afloat and hide the massive missing capital, Jonathan had resorted to outright theft from his own inner circle. He had actively solicited early private investments from Brad, his sleazy new business partner, and my former boyfriend, under the direct guise of funding a massive warehouse expansion project. Instead of building infrastructure, Jonathan illegally redirected Brad's entire capital injection directly into the operational accounts to quietly cover the massive financial hole Cameron had created. When Brad's initial money ran out, Jonathan had targeted Jamal using his own daughter's marriage to secure massive initial hedge fund deposits. He was essentially running a desperate familial Ponzi scheme, constantly moving stolen money around to mask the catastrophic reality that Atlas Logistics was entirely insolvent and actively bleeding out. Jamal leaned heavily over the boardroom table, his voice vibrating with absolute, unfiltered disgust. He looked directly into Jonathan's terrified eyes and informed him that he had not just defrauded a regional hedge fund. He had actively stolen from his own family to protect a parasitic thief. Jamal explicitly stated that, as a licensed financial fiduciary, he was legally obligated to report the massive wire fraud and blatant embezzlement to the Securities and Exchange Commission immediately. There would be no quiet family settlement to preserve their social standing. There would be no grace period to secure alternative funding. Jamal was aggressively liquidating his entire position, severing all personal and professional ties with the family, and handing the forensic evidence directly to the federal authorities to protect his own firm from criminal complicity. The pristine, untouchable image of the perfect golden son completely shattered right there in the boardroom. Cameron, the man who had confidently called my secure line to demand a 20% equity stake in my tech empire just days prior, suddenly broke down into violent hysterical sobs. He physically collapsed, falling to his knees and clutching the edge of the mahogany table, begging Jamal not to send him to federal prison. He frantically blamed the volatile crypto markets. He blamed the overwhelming stress of his executive title, and he even hysterically tried to blame his father for giving him too much financial access in the first place. The fierce, arrogant loyalty between the patriarch and his chosen heir dissolved instantly, replaced by pathetic mutual recrimination as they both realized they were facing decades behind bars. The news of the finalized audit quickly leaked out of the hedge fund and hit the Chicago financial sector like a devastating shockwave. I read the detailed summary from the absolute safety of my San Francisco penthouse overlooking the sparkling bay. The sheer irony was profoundly beautiful and deeply cathartic. The very same family that had violently cast me out into the snow, branding me a toxic failure, had been completely destroyed by the exact person they worshipped. I had built a $150 million empire entirely on a foundation of absolute truth, relentless hard work, and technological transparency. They had built their entire identity on a mountain of toxic lies, and Cameron, the beloved golden child, had eagerly lit the match that burned it all permanently to the ground. The destruction of Atlas Logistics did not remain confined to the heavily secured walls of Jamal's hedge fund. The toxic shockwave expanded outward with brutal efficiency, completely annihilating every single alliance my father had so arrogantly forged. The first casualty of this rapid financial contagion was the very man they had all gleefully chosen over me on that freezing Christmas Eve. Brad, my deceitful ex-boyfriend, and Jonathan's supposed savior had spent the last 8 months parading around Chicago as the new, highly influential operational partner of Atlas Logistics. But Brad was a predatory opportunist at his core, and predators possess an incredible instinct for sensing when the prey is finally dead. The exact second the rumors of Jamal's forensic audit leaked into the regional financial gossip circles, Brad realized he was standing on a massive, unexploded landmine. He had aggressively leveraged his own fragile wealth to buy his way into my father's inner circle, fully believing he was securing a highly lucrative logistical empire. When he discovered through his own panicked back-channel inquiries that his entire capital injection had been illegally cannibalized to cover Cameron's disastrous cryptocurrency gambling, Brad did not bother confronting Jonathan. He did not ask for a strategic family meeting or demand a refund. He simply executed a ruthless, silent exit strategy. Because Jonathan had been so deeply desperate to secure Brad's money, he had foolishly granted him joint signatory access to the few remaining healthy operational accounts Atlas Logistics possessed. Late on a Friday night, while Jonathan was locked in his mansion frantically screaming at his incompetent defense attorneys, Brad logged into the corporate banking portal. In a series of rapid, highly untraceable digital wire transfers, Brad completely drained every single remaining dollar of liquid cash from the company ledgers. He emptied the emergency payroll reserves, he liquidated the minor vendor escrow accounts, and he completely gutted the final remaining operational safety nets. By the time the sun rose on Saturday morning, Brad had boarded a direct flight out of the state, permanently relocating to a jurisdiction highly resistant to corporate extradition, leaving my father holding an entirely empty bag. The absolute betrayal by his chosen business partner was catastrophic, but the destruction of Jonathan's familial alliance was significantly more brutal. Jamal was a man who worshipped his flawless financial reputation above all else. The realization that his own father-in-law had actively attempted to use his prestigious hedge fund as a dumping ground for a massive illegal Ponzi scheme ignited a terrifying cold rage within him. Jamal did not return to his luxury downtown penthouse to comfort his highly distressed wife. He returned with a team of aggressive private security contractors and a ruthless high-powered divorce attorney. Melanie was sitting in their expansive living room, aggressively scrolling through her phone, attempting to formulate a public relations strategy to distance herself from her father's collapse. She barely had time to look up before Jamal's security team began systematically packing her expensive designer clothing into generic cardboard boxes. Jamal stood in the massive marble entryway, refusing to even look his wife in the eye. He handed her a thick, heavily binding stack of expedited divorce papers. He explicitly informed her that he had preemptively frozen all of their joint marital assets and that a luxury town car was currently waiting downstairs to permanently escort her off the property. Melanie completely lost her mind. The smug, condescending woman who had proudly acted as a physical bouncer keeping me out of my own childhood home was suddenly reduced to a hysterical, frantic mess. She screamed, she cried, and she desperately tried to manipulate Jamal by reminding him of their prestigious social standing. But her tears were entirely useless against a man whose core financial architecture had just been severely threatened. Jamal calmly interrupted her frantic sobbing to deliver the final lethal blow. He informed her that his legal team had formally filed a massive multi-million-dollar civil lawsuit against both her father and Atlas Logistics, effectively ensuring that the entire family would be buried under insurmountable legal debt for the rest of their natural lives. He then ordered his security team to physically remove her from the penthouse. With Brad fleeing the state with the final remaining liquid capital and Jamal dropping a massive financial nuclear bomb on the corporate entity, the primary source of the family's immense unearned privilege finally buckled. The sprawling, luxurious suburban mansion had always been a massive financial anchor heavily mortgaged against the artificially inflated projections of Atlas Logistics. Without Brad's stolen money quietly covering the astronomical monthly payments, and with the federal government actively freezing Jonathan's remaining personal accounts, the mortgage payment violently bounced. The elite banking institution that held the title did not offer a grace period or a polite extension. They operated with the exact same ruthless efficiency my software provided to my clients. Less than 2 weeks after my father had arrogantly stormed into my San Francisco headquarters, demanding a $45 million ransom, a highly visible neon orange foreclosure notice was aggressively stapled to the massive heavy oak front doors of his pristine suburban estate. The grand sweeping facade that they had weaponized to intimidate their neighbors and establish their false superiority was officially dead. The bank initiated immediate, highly aggressive eviction proceedings. Catherine, the woman who had happily served roasted duck to my cheating ex-boyfriend while I froze in the snow, was suddenly facing the terrifying reality of becoming completely homeless. The entire toxic syndicate that had gleefully celebrated my absolute lowest point on Christmas Eve had effectively cannibalized itself, leaving absolutely nothing behind but a mountain of debt and shattered egos. I had not originally planned on returning to the Midwest so soon, but absolute market domination occasionally requires a physical corporate presence. My executive team had recently secured a monumental software integration contract with the largest banking conglomerate in Illinois. To heavily solidify the massive regional expansion, I had quietly purchased a sprawling, ultra-luxurious penthouse in the Gold Coast neighborhood of Chicago. I wanted a permanent, heavily fortified fortress in the very city that had once tried to completely break me. My private jet landed at the international airport on a Tuesday evening, right in the middle of a freak late summer storm. The dark sky had violently ripped open, unleashing a torrential downpour that quickly turned the city streets into fast-moving, aggressive rivers. I sat in the spacious, heavily climate-controlled back seat of my chauffeured black luxury vehicle, sipping a warm cup of expensive artisan tea. The thick, soundproof glass of the heavy car completely muted the chaotic thunder and the aggressive drumming of the relentless rain. I watched the dark, wet city blur past me, feeling an immense, profound sense of peace. The violent weather heavily mirrored the brutal, freezing blizzard of that fateful Christmas Eve, but this time the narrative was entirely rewritten. I was no longer the terrified, broke girl, exposed to the harsh elements dragging a garbage bag of cheap belongings. I was wrapped in absolute, impenetrable luxury. As my driver smoothly navigated the winding private road leading to the secure wrought iron gates of my new penthouse building, the heavy headlights suddenly caught a frantic, chaotic movement in the darkness. Four distinct figures suddenly lunged out from behind the thick stone security pillars, throwing their physical bodies directly into the path of my moving vehicle. My highly trained driver instinctively slammed his heavy boot onto the brakes. The massive car violently jerked forward, the thick tires hydroplaning slightly on the slick black asphalt before coming to a jarring, complete halt mere inches away from the trespassers. My driver immediately reached inside his tailored jacket for his registered weapon, verbally instructing me to stay down and secure my seatbelt. But I did not duck. I leaned forward, staring intently through the rain-slicked windshield. The bright, high-beam headlights illuminated the pathetic, soaked figures standing in the torrential downpour. It was my entire family. They had somehow bypassed the outer neighborhood security patrols and had been standing in the freezing rain, waiting for my vehicle to arrive. The visual transformation was absolutely staggering. There were no tailored corporate suits, no expensive designer dresses, and absolutely zero arrogant, condescending smirks. They looked like terrified, drowned animals, violently shivering in the harsh, blinding white light of the headlights. Jonathan immediately rushed toward the side of the car, slamming his wet, heavy palms against my reinforced passenger window. Catherine was right behind him, her ruined, expensive hair plastered flat against her skull, and thick black makeup aggressively running down her cheeks like dark mud. Melanie and Cameron stood slightly further back, physically holding on to each other for warmth, completely stripped of their toxic golden child and chosen daughter status. They were just two terrified, broke adults facing the brutal, inescapable consequences of their own massive financial crimes. I tapped the digital control panel on my armrest, slowly lowering my thick window just 3 precise inches. The sudden violent roar of the storm flooded into the quiet, warm cabin, bringing with it the sharp, freezing wind and the overwhelming, pathetic stench of their utter desperation. I did not invite them inside. I did not instruct my driver to unlock the heavy doors. I sat comfortably in the warm, ambient glow of the vehicle, staring out at them with the exact same cold, detached silence they had given me on that freezing porch 8 months ago. My father pushed his face aggressively close to the narrow opening in the glass. He was loudly sobbing, his massive chest heaving as the freezing rain ruthlessly lashed against his pale skin. The powerful, domineering patriarch was completely gone, permanently replaced by a broken, frantic man begging for his very survival. He practically screamed over the deafening thunder, abandoning every single ounce of his fabricated pride. He begged me for a $10 million immediate bailout. He stated the massive number with a frantic, terrifying urgency, his voice cracking under the intense emotional weight. Jonathan frantically explained that the federal financial authorities were closing in rapidly and that a massive cash injection was the absolute only way to pay off the stolen hedge fund capital. He openly admitted his massive corporate fraud, crying that buying off Jamal was the only mathematical way to keep Cameron out of a brutal federal penitentiary. He sobbed that the regional bank had already locked them out of the suburban mansion and that Catherine was physically ill from the sheer terrifying stress of becoming entirely homeless. He pleaded with me aggressively, invoking my title as his daughter, demanding that I save the family legacy from total public annihilation. He desperately promised that if I just wrote the massive $10 million check, they would publicly apologize and finally treat me with the genuine respect I had always deserved. I listened to his frantic, hysterical negotiation as the heavy rain violently punished them. He was still trying to barter with me, completely failing to realize that he possessed absolutely zero leverage in this dynamic. He truly believed a $10 million ransom could instantly purchase his way out of massive federal indictments and buy back the suburban mansion he had illegally mortgaged. Catherine aggressively pushed her way forward, gripping the wet, freezing edge of my window, weeping uncontrollably. She begged me to look at Cameron, screaming that he was my own flesh and blood and that his fragile spirit would not survive a single week inside a maximum security prison environment. I slowly turned my gaze toward the back of the group, looking directly at Cameron. The arrogant golden boy who had confidently demanded a massive equity stake in my protected corporate empire just weeks prior was violently shaking in the cold. His expensive clothes were ruined, his face was a sickly pale, and he was completely devoid of any remaining hope. He looked absolutely terrified, an empty, hollow shell of a man who finally understood that his reckless criminal actions had permanently destroyed his entire universe. I looked at the four of them, standing in the freezing torrential downpour, desperately begging for a tiny fraction of my immense self-made wealth. The absolute cosmic poetry of this precise moment was so deeply profound, it felt perfectly orchestrated by an unforgiving higher power. They had violently locked me out in a freezing blizzard to protect their fragile, toxic image and secure their fake superiority. Now the universe had ruthlessly locked them out in a violent, relentless storm, forcing them to physically kneel and beg the exact same person they had so eagerly discarded. The cycle was completely unbroken, but the roles were permanently and beautifully reversed. I did not leave them begging at the glass for long. The visual poetry of their absolute desperation was deeply satisfying, but I required total closure. I tapped the thick glass partition dividing the cabin and gave my driver a single brief nod. He instantly shifted the massive vehicle into park and quickly retrieved a large, heavy black umbrella from the passenger console. He stepped out into the violent storm, the rain instantly soaking his dark suit as he rapidly moved around the front of the hood to my door. He pulled the heavy reinforced door open and simultaneously deployed the wide umbrella, creating a perfectly dry protective canopy against the raging elements. I smoothly stepped out of the warm luxury cabin and placed my expensive designer heels onto the slick flooded pavement. I stood completely upright, entirely shielded from the violent storm by the massive black canopy held firmly above my head. The freezing wind violently whipped the edges of my tailored wool coat, but not a single drop of rain touched my skin. I stared down at the four pathetic figures huddled together in the torrential downpour. They instinctively took a collective step backward, deeply intimidated by the massive physical presence of my armed driver and the absolute cold authority radiating from my posture. My father was practically hyperventilating. The heavy rain washed the remaining color from his face, making him look like a crumbling, hollow statue. He fell to his knees, his expensive tailored trousers soaking up the dirty, freezing puddle pooling around his legs. He looked up at me with wild, frantic eyes, entirely consumed by a paranoid, toxic delusion. He began to aggressively rationalize his massive corporate fraud, attempting to rewrite reality one final time. He screamed over the deafening thunder, claiming that he had the entire situation completely under control before the ambush. He violently slammed his wet fist against his own thigh, sobbing that his master plan was entirely flawless. He swore that he just needed a few more months to quietly move Brad's capital around and patch the massive $12 million crater Cameron had created. Then his voice shifted into a tone of raw, bitter venom. He aggressively shouted that the only reason his empire was collapsing was because of a cowardly anonymous whistleblower. He cried that if it were not for whoever maliciously tipped off Jamal's forensic auditors, the family would have easily survived. He was completely incapable of accepting his own profound failure, desperately searching for a phantom enemy to blame for his own criminal arrogance. I stood perfectly still under the heavy black umbrella, letting his pathetic delusional rant wash over me. The sheer, unadulterated ignorance required to believe that a massive corporate financial system could be fixed with a few more months of illegal shell games was genuinely breathtaking. I looked at Cameron, who was violently shivering and staring at the pavement, unable to even make eye contact with me. I looked at Catherine, whose mascara-stained face was twisted into a mask of pure terror. Then I looked back down at the broken patriarch kneeling in the dirty, freezing water. I spoke, my voice completely calm, flat, and entirely devoid of any familial warmth. The quiet, lethal tone easily cut through the chaotic roar of the storm. I told Jonathan that he was still suffering from a terminal case of profound arrogance. I informed him that the universe did not care enough about his pathetic little logistics company to send an anonymous tip to a regional hedge fund. I explained that there was absolutely no malicious whistleblower hiding in the shadows trying to sabotage his precious legacy. My father stopped crying for a fraction of a second, his wet face contorting in deep, utter confusion. He asked me how Jamal could have possibly known to launch a massive forensic strike on that specific Monday morning. I let a slow, sharp, completely merciless smile touch my lips. I looked directly into his terrified, wide eyes and delivered the ultimate masterstroke. I told him that Jamal was a highly ruthless financial optimizer who despised inefficiency. I explained that earlier this month, Jamal's hedge fund had aggressively upgraded their entire internal risk assessment protocol. To protect his massive financial portfolio from toxic investments, Jamal had purchased an enterprise corporate license for my artificial intelligence software. The words hung in this freezing air, heavy and absolutely devastating. I watched the cognitive gears slowly, violently grind inside my father's head as the terrifying truth began to finally set in. I did not stop. I explicitly detailed the exact mechanical process of their absolute destruction. I told them that my artificial intelligence platform did not target Atlas Logistics, specifically out of petty personal revenge. My software was simply executing a standard preliminary scan on all of Jamal's pending regional acquisitions. The program ingested 10 entire years of Jonathan's heavily manipulated ledgers, his desperate offshore shell accounts, and his highly fabricated vendor invoices. It processed billions of data points, cross-referencing every single fraudulent digital transaction they had ever authorized. I took a single step closer to my father, ensuring he heard every single syllable of his final judgment. I told him that the complex labyrinth of human lies he had spent a decade desperately building was completely meaningless against pure mathematical perfection. My software sliced through his aggressive corporate fraud with terrifying, brutal precision. It isolated the massive hidden deficits, located the exact missing capital, and found Cameron's digital crypto trading fingerprints buried deep within the payroll code. I paused, letting the freezing rain violently lash against their terrified faces. I lowered my voice to a sharp, lethal whisper and delivered the final metric. I told them that my software audited their entire corrupt decade and completely dismantled their fraudulent empire in exactly 3.2 seconds. The psychological annihilation was entirely instantaneous and profoundly beautiful to witness. The absolute jaw-dropping horror that washed over their soaked faces was something I will remember for the rest of my natural life. The very same technology they had aggressively mocked on Christmas Eve, the software I had desperately coded on a dirty mattress while they starved me, was the exact, precise instrument of their total downfall. I had not actively plotted against them. I had not weaponized my massive wealth to seek petty, vindictive revenge. My pure, unadulterated competence had simply brought them to absolute justice. Cameron let out a hollow, broken wail, finally realizing that my genius had directly sealed his federal prison sentence. Melanie buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably as the reality of her complete social and financial ruin completely set in. Jonathan remained frozen on his knees, his mouth hanging slightly open, staring at me like I was a terrifying divine entity that had just handed down an inescapable apocalyptic judgment. They were utterly permanently destroyed by the exact same brilliance they had tried to violently extinguish. I did not offer them a single penny. I did not offer them a final comforting word. I simply turned my back on the pathetic ruined figures kneeling in the flooded street. I stepped back into the warm, luxurious cabin of my vehicle, and my driver firmly slammed the heavy reinforced door shut, instantly muting their frantic, hysterical screams. I settled into the plush leather seat, picked up my warm artisan tea, and instructed my driver to proceed through the security gates. I left them outside in the freezing torrential rain exactly where they permanently belonged. The heavy luxury vehicle began to slowly roll forward, its thick tires cutting through the rising floodwaters as the massive wrought iron security gates began to mechanically part. I stared straight ahead, ready to permanently close this pathetic chapter of my life. But the sheer terrifying reality of her impending homelessness finally shattered whatever fragile remnants of sanity Catherine still possessed. She broke away from the huddled weeping group and recklessly threw her drenched body against the side of my moving car. Her frantic hands violently slapped against the reinforced glass of my passenger window, slipping and sliding on the slick, wet surface. My driver immediately slammed his heavy boot on the brakes for a second time, a low, dangerous growl of absolute annoyance escaping his throat as he reached for his weapon. I raised a single hand, calmly instructing him to stand down. I tapped the digital control panel, lowering the thick glass just a few precise inches once again, allowing the violent roar of the Chicago storm to flood back into the pristine cabin. Catherine was completely unhinged. Her expensive manicured nails desperately clawed at the narrow opening, her face distorted into a horrifying mask of pure, primal panic. The mansion was not merely a piece of real estate to her. It was the very core of her entire existence. That sprawling suburban estate was her ultimate weapon, her undeniable proof of social superiority, and her daily validation. Without the grand, sweeping staircase, the imported marble floors, and the exclusive zip code, she was absolutely nothing. She shoved her wet face against the glass, crying with a pathetic, desperate intensity that completely erased her decades of arrogant conditioning. She aggressively begged me to forget the corporate fraud and ignore Cameron's catastrophic embezzlement. She pleaded with me to just focus on the real estate. She screamed over the deafening thunder, begging me to at least help them save the house. She sobbed violently, claiming that it was their sacred family home and that they would have absolutely nowhere to go when the bank agents arrived with the local sheriff in the morning. I sat perfectly still in my heated leather seat, letting her frantic, hysterical cries wash over me. I looked at the ruined mascara aggressively streaming down her face, and the pathetic way she clung to the edge of my window, like a drowning rat clinging to a piece of driftwood. A slow, cold, and entirely detached smile stretched across my face. It was not a smile of joy or malicious glee, but a profound expression of absolute, undeniable victory. I looked directly into her wild, desperate eyes and spoke in a voice that was smooth, flat, and sharper than a surgical scalpel. I calmly informed her that she did not need to worry about the bank agents or the local sheriff arriving in the morning. I told her that the aggressive foreclosure process had actually concluded much faster than the regional banking executives had originally anticipated. I explained that while she was frantically packing her designer bags and crying over her ruined social life, I was having a quiet cup of artisan coffee in my San Francisco office. I told her that earlier this very morning, I had authorized my lead asset manager to attend the exclusive closed-door commercial banking auction. Catherine suddenly stopped crying. Her frantic breathing hitched as a new profound terror began to rapidly form in her chest. I leaned slightly closer to the narrow opening in the glass, ensuring my voice pierced directly through the chaotic noise of the torrential rain. I explicitly told her that I had already purchased the entire sprawling estate. I bought the physical deed, the heavily manicured grounds, and the imported marble floors, using a microscopic fraction of my liquid operational capital. I owned it free and clear. A fleeting delusional spark of hope suddenly flashed in her wet eyes. For one brief, agonizing second, she actually believed I had purchased the estate to graciously gift it back to them. She believed her desperate begging had finally worked. I instantly crushed that pathetic delusion. I kept my cold, detached smile perfectly locked in place and delivered the final absolute nail in their collective coffin. I told her that I had indeed purchased the property, but she and Jonathan would absolutely never step foot inside it again. I informed her that the grand architectural symbol of their toxic, unearned privilege was utterly useless to me. I explained that I had already signed a highly expedited commercial demolition contract. I told her that next Tuesday, a fleet of heavy industrial bulldozers was scheduled to completely level the entire mansion, reducing her beloved crystal chandeliers and sweeping staircases to a massive pile of worthless, toxic rubble. Catherine gasped, physically recoiling from the vehicle, as if I had just struck her across the face with a heavy iron bar. I did not break eye contact. I calmly explained that the sprawling suburban acreage was mathematically perfectly situated for my new regional logistics division. I told her that once the rubble was cleared, I was pouring 10,000 tons of concrete over her ruined garden to build a massive corporate retreat and a multi-level parking structure for my mid-level software engineers. I watched her completely break. The absolute horror of knowing that her precious, sacred social fortress was going to become a literal parking lot for my employees was the final psychological blow. I looked at her shivering, drenched form and delivered my final, perfectly calculated statement. I reminded her of that freezing Christmas Eve when she stood on her warm, brightly lit porch and watched me drag my cheap belongings into the snow. I told her that she did not have any space for me in her perfect house then. I stated with absolute chilling finality that now I was simply making my own space. I did not wait for her response. I pressed the digital button on my armrest, and the thick, reinforced glass smoothly glided shut, completely severing her frantic wails. I gave my driver a sharp nod. The heavy luxury vehicle surged forward smoothly, passing through the massive wrought iron gates. The heavy metal doors instantly locked behind us, leaving my ruined, shattered family kneeling in the rising floodwaters exactly where they permanently belonged. The heavy iron gates closing behind my luxury vehicle that night did not just block out the freezing rain. They permanently sealed off an entire toxic chapter of my existence. The subsequent 6 months unfolded with a slow, highly methodical precision that I found deeply satisfying. The federal justice system operates on an entirely different timeline than the fast-paced tech world, but it is equally as ruthless when handed a perfectly wrapped gift. The massive 400-page forensic audit my software had generated was handed directly to the Department of Justice by Jamal. The federal prosecutors did not even have to work hard to build their case. The digital paper trail of massive wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and illegal financial manipulation was so pristine and undeniable that they refused to offer any form of leniency or polite negotiation. On a crisp Tuesday morning in early spring, the official federal indictments were finally unsealed. Jonathan and Cameron were publicly arrested in the lobby of a cheap roadside motel they had been hiding in. They were aggressively handcuffed by heavily armed federal agents and paraded in front of local news cameras, completely stripped of their bespoke suits and unearned arrogance. I watched the brief, highly publicized arraignment hearing on a secure digital monitor from my San Francisco office. Cameron looked entirely destroyed, his shoulders violently shaking, as the federal judge coldly read out the astronomical list of severe felony charges. The arrogant golden child who had once confidently demanded a massive slice of my tech empire was now facing a mandatory minimum of 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Jonathan stood beside him, completely silent, his domineering patriarchal presence permanently erased. He looked like a hollow ghost of a man finally forced to absorb the terrifying reality that his entire massive legacy was just a cheap criminal illusion. With the patriarchal figures locked away in a highly secure federal holding facility, awaiting a heavily publicized trial, the reality for Catherine and Melanie rapidly deteriorated into a beautiful, poetic justice. True to my word, exactly 1 week after our final encounter in the rain, a fleet of heavy industrial bulldozers rolled onto their beloved suburban estate. The grand sweeping facade, the imported marble floors, and the pristine manicured lawns were systematically reduced to a massive pile of worthless toxic dust. the physical manifestation of their elitism, is now a highly efficient, multi-level concrete parking structure for my mid-level regional software engineers. Without the massive stolen corporate funds to artificially inflate their luxurious lifestyle, Catherine and Melanie experienced a brutal, immediate freefall down the socioeconomic ladder. They were violently evicted from the affluent bubble they had weaponized their entire lives. With all personal bank accounts entirely frozen by the government and absolutely zero marketable skills, they were forced to rent a highly cramped, severely outdated two-bedroom apartment on the extreme industrial outskirts of the city. The women who used to spend their afternoons aggressively mocking the working class while sipping expensive champagne were suddenly forced into the exact same brutal daily grind they had always despised. Melanie, the chosen daughter who had proudly acted as a physical bouncer, keeping me out of my own childhood home, is now working a highly demanding minimum wage job, folding cheap denim at a fast fashion retail outlet in a dying suburban strip mall. She spends her exhausting days being aggressively yelled at by impatient teenagers. Catherine, the grand matriarch who happily served roasted duck to my cheating ex-boyfriend while I froze outside, now spends 40 brutal hours a week standing behind a brightly lit cosmetic counter, aggressively pushing cheap perfume samples onto entirely disinterested shoppers. Her imported designer shoes have been permanently replaced by cheap, thick orthopedics, just to handle the grueling physical pain of standing all day. They are permanently trapped in a relentless cycle of exhausting manual labor, forced to smile and genuinely serve the general public just to barely afford their basic monthly utilities. While their toxic universe completely collapsed upon itself, my own empire expanded into the absolute stratosphere. The highly publicized federal downfall of Atlas Logistics inadvertently served as the ultimate global advertisement for my artificial intelligence software. Corporate enterprise licenses skyrocketed instantly, and my personal net worth safely surged well past the initial $150 million valuation. But I did not hoard this massive influx of new capital or use it to buy meaningless luxury estates just to show off to superficial wealthy neighbors. I heavily reinvested it into the exact demographic my family had actively tried to destroy. I launched a massive multi-million-dollar philanthropic foundation specifically designed to aggressively fund young female entrepreneurs who possess brilliant technological concepts but absolutely zero financial or familial support. I am actively providing the exact same critical safety net I was violently denied. Every single day, my executive team signs major seed capital checks for brilliant young women who were kicked out of their homes, cast aside, or aggressively told they were entirely worthless by the very people who were supposed to protect them. We bypassed the toxic patriarchal venture capital gatekeepers, entirely giving these women the raw operational capital they need to immediately launch their platforms. I am using the massive wealth generated from my own personal trauma to physically build an unstoppable army of highly successful, financially independent women who will never have to beg anyone for a seat at the table. Looking back at the freezing violent blizzard on that fateful Christmas Eve, I do not feel any lingering resentment or sadness. I feel a profound sense of absolute crystal clear gratitude. The brutal rejection I experienced on that porch was not a tragic death sentence. It was the ultimate necessary liberation. My family truly thought they were discarding a broken, worthless piece of trash, but they were actually planting a highly aggressive seed in incredibly fertile soil. They taught me that family love is conditional, so I applied my own conditions. Cutting out toxic blood isn't a tragedy, it's a rebirth. Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family to build your own empire? How did you take your power back? Let me know in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and remember, never let anyone convince you that you are worthless. The saga of Sydney and the spectacular collapse of Atlas Logistics offers a profound masterclass in the true nature of power, resilience, and self-worth. The most critical lesson woven through this devastating narrative is that biological relation does not automatically entitle anyone to unconditional loyalty, especially when that relationship is built on a toxic foundation of manipulation, abuse, and superficiality. For far too long, society has aggressively weaponized the concept of family, demanding that individuals endure highly destructive environments simply because of shared DNA. However, this story completely shatters that dangerous paradigm, proving that walking away from abusive blood ties is not a selfish act of betrayal, but an absolute necessary step toward personal salvation and rebirth. When faced with absolute betrayal from those meant to protect us, the human instinct for vindictive revenge is entirely natural. Yet the narrative brilliantly demonstrates that the most devastating retaliation is simply unadulterated, undeniable competence. By refusing to engage in the chaotic, illegal machinations of her relatives, the protagonist allowed their own arrogance and deceit to become the precise architects of their ultimate destruction. She did not have to actively plot their downfall because her mathematical precision, relentless work ethic, and unwavering commitment to the truth acted as a perfect mirror, exposing their deep rot to the harsh light of reality. This serves as an incredibly powerful daily reminder that we are the sole authors of our own value and destiny. When any environment demands that you physically or emotionally shrink yourself just to protect the fragile egos of others, the only logical response is to remove yourself entirely and build an impenetrable empire where your unique brilliance is celebrated. Evaluate your own inner circle today and ruthlessly cut ties with anyone who demands you sacrifice your peace for their personal, absolute comfort.